What if everything you believe to be yourself, your I, your desires, fears, ambitions, and even your body, is nothing but an illusion? Imagine that the sense of separation from the world and other people is not an innate truth, but a perceptual error imposed by the structure of our consciousness. This is precisely what Arthur Schopenhauer, one of the most radical philosophers of the 19th century, claims. Inspired by Eastern wisdom and armed with Western metaphysics, he dismantles familiar notions of self, free will, morality, and suffering. In his system, a human being is not an autonomous entity, but a temporary manifestation of a single blind striving he calls the will. This is not just philosophy. It is a challenge to our entire worldview. Immerse yourself in reflections that may change your perception of existence itself. Part 1. The Illusion of Individuality in Maya. One of the most profound and revolutionary ideas put forward by Arthur Schopenhauer was his claim that individual existence, as we commonly experience it, is not ultimately real. He proposed that our deep-seated sense of being separate, self-contained individuals is an illusion, a product of the mind's habitual way of interpreting the world. Schopenhauer referred to this illusion using the ancient Sanskrit term Maya. This concept, in his view, was not just an abstract philosophical curiosity. It lay at the very heart of human suffering and ethical failure. To transcend this illusion and perceive reality as it truly is, Schopenhauer believed, was the key to inner transformation and liberation. How the illusion is constructed. According to Schopenhauer, the illusion of individuality stems from how our minds shape all experience through fundamental categories: space, time, and causality. Drawing from Immanuel Kant's philosophy, Schopenhauer argued that these structures are not features of the world itself, but are imposed by our consciousness. Because of this mental structuring, we inevitably see reality as divided into separate objects, each existing in its own location, lasting for a particular duration, and interacting with others through cause and effect. For example, when you scan a room, you instantly and effortlessly distinguish chairs, walls, other people, all seen as individual entities, each occupying a different space. But this perceptual division, Schopenhauer argued, exists only on the surface, in the realm of appearances. The deeper nature of reality is not divided or fragmented. What we perceive as separateness is a mental framework, not a reflection of what is actually there. A deeper reality, unity beneath the surface. At the most fundamental level, Schopenhauer believed that there exists only one underlying force, the will. What we consider to be separate wills, yours, mine, and everyone else's, are all expressions of this single, undivided reality. Individual boundaries between self and other, between subject and object, are not real in any ultimate sense. They serve a practical function in our everyday lives, allowing us to make decisions and navigate the world. But they are illusions when it comes to understanding what truly exists. This has startling ethical implications. When you hurt someone else, Schopenhauer would say, you are in fact hurting yourself, even if the illusion of separation prevents you from seeing it. Competing with others for limited resources is, on a deeper level, the same as one limb of a body attacking another. It is conflict within a single unified being. Echoes from the East. Influence of Indian philosophy. Schopenhauer found striking confirmation of these ideas in the ancient wisdom of Indian thought, especially in the Upanishads and Buddhist teachings. These traditions had long taught that the individual self is not ultimately real, and that true enlightenment comes from recognizing the essential unity underlying all apparent distinctions. The Hindu idea of Atman, the inner self that is identical in all living beings, mirrors Schopenhauer's concept of the will, a universal essence present in all things. Similarly, the Buddhist doctrine of Anatman or no self closely parallels his belief that the personal ego is a temporary mental construct, not a lasting reality. Schopenhauer was one of the first major Western philosophers to seriously engage with these Eastern teachings, integrating them into the framework of European thought. He believed that his philosophy provided a rational, structured foundation for the spiritual truths that Indian sages had discovered through meditative insight and direct experience. How the illusion operates, mechanisms of Maya. Schopenhauer dissected the illusion of individuality by identifying the specific mental mechanisms that produce it. First among these is space. This organizing principle gives rise to the perception that objects, and by extension, people, are separate and located in different places. However, Schopenhauer argued that space does not exist independently of the objects it seems to contain. Rather, it is a function of how consciousness arranges its experience. The will, the single, undivided reality, is not located anywhere in particular because it is not an object among other objects. It is the inner nature of everything. But as soon as it appears within the framework of consciousness, it must take the form of spatial entities defined by boundaries, sizes, and positions. This spatial structure automatically gives rise to the illusion of separation and multiplicity. Yet beneath this surface lies a unified field of existence, timeless, boundaryless, and whole. Conclusion: from illusion to liberation. In summary, what we commonly take to be our separate, personal identity is an illusion created by the mind's interpretive framework. Schopenhauer invites us to look beyond this illusion, to see ourselves and others not as fragmented parts, but as expressions of one universal force. To understand this intellectually is already transformative. But to see it directly, Schopenhauer believed, is the beginning of true liberation. The illusion of separation, time, causality, and the self in Schopenhauer's philosophy. Time as a structuring illusion. Time, as we commonly understand it, gives the impression that each of us possesses a unique life story, a personal timeline of experiences and choices. It paints a picture in which your life begins at birth, progresses through various stages of growth and decision-making, and eventually concludes with death. This unfolding narrative seems to define who you are. However, Arthur Schopenhauer challenges this entire conception. He argues that this temporal storyline belongs not to reality itself, but to the realm of human perception, what he calls representation. The underlying will, according to him, exists outside the bounds of time. It is not born, it does not die, and it does not evolve. What we perceive as our birth is merely the will expressing itself through a particular physical form. Likewise, what we interpret as death is simply the will ceasing to manifest through that form, only to continue its expression elsewhere. Causality and the illusion of separate agents. The idea of causation fosters the belief that individuals are autonomous agents, capable of independently affecting the world and each other. It appears that you act by your own volition, while others act according to theirs, sometimes aiding your goals, sometimes obstructing them, based on their own motivations. Yet Schopenhauer proposes that this apparent independence is deceptive. All seemingly separate agents are, in truth, expressions of the same singular will. When one person offers help to another, it is the will aiding itself. When one person causes harm, it is the will inflicting pain upon itself. The full range of human relationships, conflict, cooperation, love, betrayal, is simply the will encountering itself through different bodily forms. Individuality and the roots of suffering. Grasping the illusory nature of individual separateness has profound consequences, particularly for our understanding of suffering, morality, and liberation. Much of human suffering stems from the ego's struggle to preserve and enhance its perceived individuality. We suffer when our goals are blocked, when we are criticized, or when our sense of self is threatened. But if the self we cling to is merely a construction, a byproduct of how consciousness organizes experience, then the suffering that arises from protecting it is grounded in a falsehood. The ego, with all its fears and cravings, is not our ultimate nature. It is a fleeting appearance, not an enduring reality. Recognizing this doesn't instantly end our pain, but it opens the door to a deeper truth. Suffering is not as inevitable or solid as it seems. Ethics without separation. In this light, ethical behavior arises not from external rules or fear of consequences, but from insight. Traditional morality often assumes a fundamental opposition between self and other, requiring systems of duties or rewards to encourage kindness. But if the division between self and others is ultimately unreal, then harming another becomes indistinguishable from harming oneself. Seen through this lens, compassion becomes instinctive. There's no need for complex reasoning to care for your own well-being, and likewise, no need for justification to care for others once you realize they are not truly other. Ethical action flows effortlessly when we perceive all beings as unified expressions of the same will that lives through us. Conclusion: seeing through the illusion. Schopenhauer invites us to look beyond the surface of time, causation, and individual identity. By seeing through these organizing structures of experience, we uncover a deeper unity, one in which the self is not separate, suffering is not absolute, and compassion is not optional. Liberation lies not in changing the world, but in transforming how we see it. The illusion of individuality helps explain why the pursuit of lasting happiness so often ends in disappointment. The ego, in its constant striving, seeks fulfillment through collecting achievements, possessions, relationships, and experiences, anything that might reinforce its sense of being separate and distinct from others. Yet this very ego, the driver of all these efforts, is a fiction. Attempting to nourish it is like pouring water into a phantom vessel. It never fills. One cannot shelter a shadow. No amount of external validation, wealth, recognition, or accomplishments can bring enduring peace to something that does not truly exist on its own. This is why even those who appear outwardly successful often admit to a persistent sense of emptiness, unease, or dissatisfaction. They've invested their energy in meeting the demands of something that has no real substance. And because illusions cannot be truly satisfied, no quantity of praise or possessions will ever be enough. The ego always wants more because its hunger comes from a void that cannot be filled. The philosopher Schopenhauer stressed that merely grasping the illusion of individuality on an intellectual level is not enough to dismantle it in lived experience. Our normal modes of perception, shaped by the innate frameworks of space, time, and causality, continue to operate unconsciously. These structures maintain the illusion of separateness regardless of what we believe to be true. So, even if we understand conceptually that the self is not a distinct entity, we still move through the world as if it were. In our everyday existence, we continue to act, feel, and think as individuals, disconnected from the greater whole. To truly transcend this illusion, one must enter exceptional states of consciousness that can bypass or momentarily silence these underlying mental frameworks. Such states may arise through deep aesthetic immersion, the profound experience of compassion and empathy, or ultimately, through the complete renunciation of the personal will, the drive to assert, to acquire, and to exist independently. These moments offer fleeting visions beyond Maya, the veil of illusion, allowing a glimpse into the deeper unity that underlies all forms. However, attaining full and permanent liberation from this illusion is exceedingly rare, perhaps the rarest of all human experiences. Part 2. Art and the Aesthetic Experience. Art was Schopenhauer's first profound clue that human consciousness could momentarily break free from the relentless grip of personal desire. He saw art not as mere decoration or entertainment, but as a gateway, a glimpse beyond the veil of illusion, or Maya, into a deeper, more enduring reality. His philosophy laid the groundwork for one of the most detailed and influential theories of aesthetics in modern thought. According to Schopenhauer, true art allows us to rise above our usual ego-centered awareness and enter a realm of pure, unselfish perception. In those rare moments of genuine artistic engagement, we step outside of our personal concerns, our cravings, our fears, our ambitions, and enter what he called the state of the pure subject of knowing. This shift offers not just a break from the pain of existence, but a preview of the ultimate spiritual liberation that awaits those who fully renounce the will. The aesthetic journey begins when we come face to face with something truly beautiful, something so compelling that it captures our attention entirely. This could be a breathtaking landscape, a haunting melody, a masterful painting, or a poem that stirs the soul. In that moment, everything else fades. Our sense of self, our problems, our to-do lists, even our awareness of time, the usual mental chatter, the thoughts, anxieties, plans, and memories that dominate our inner lives, suddenly fall silent. We are no longer preoccupied with who we are, what we want, or how others perceive us. Instead, we become wholly immersed in the direct, unfiltered experience of the beautiful object before us. Time appears to pause, and the usual separation between me and it begins to dissolve. And in that quiet, we encounter a deep, effortless sense of peace, one that feels whole and complete in itself. In these elevated moments of perception, something remarkable happens. Our awareness no longer processes the world as a series of specific, time-bound things that cause or are caused by other things. Instead, we begin to perceive the eternal forms, the timeless archetypes that each object expresses. When we look at a rose with aesthetic awareness, for example, we don't just see this particular bloom destined to fade in a few days. We glimpse the eternal essence of the rose, the ideal form that all roses reflect, regardless of time or place. This insight helps explain why aesthetic experiences feel timeless and universal. We intuit that what we're seeing isn't just significant now, but always, across all of space and time. Just as the object is elevated beyond the physical, so too is the observer. Our usual sense of self, defined by our personal story, desires, and individuality, temporarily dissolves. In its place remains pure awareness, unshaped, unowned, and undivided. We cease to be isolated individuals, and instead become vessels of universal perception. This transformation is what makes art such a powerful bridge between people, cultures, and eras. The same state of consciousness that contemplates the grandeur of a Gothic cathedral can also be stirred by a modern sculpture or a minimalist composition. Despite the differences in time, culture, or style, the experience of aesthetic beauty taps into the same core of universal awareness. Ultimately, what Schopenhauer shows us is that aesthetic experience reveals a shared foundation of consciousness, one that transcends our superficial differences. Through art, we rediscover that, beneath all diversity, there is a common essence capable of recognizing beauty, peace, and truth. The hierarchy of art in Schopenhauer's aesthetics. Schopenhauer believed that each form of art grants access to different layers of universal truth, or what he called ideas, offering distinct types of aesthetic experiences. At the most fundamental level lies architecture, which embodies the lowest degree of the will's manifestation. It reveals the raw elemental forces of nature: gravity, cohesion, pressure, and structural resistance. A beautifully designed structure doesn't just serve function, it illuminates the timeless principles that govern how matter behaves under stress. When we admire the elegance of a building, we are witnessing the invisible laws of physics rendered visible through space and form. Gothic cathedrals, for instance, transform intangible forces like thrust and counterthrust into awe-inspiring stone symphonies. These monumental works allow us to sense the silent order underlying the physical world. Sculpture and painting, embodying the human ideal. Sculpture and painting ascend to a higher plane by portraying organic life and human figures. A masterful sculpture does more than replicate a specific individual. It channels enduring archetypes that echo through history: the hero, the mother, the sage, the warrior, the lover. These figures are not mere representations. They are expressions of essential human qualities that remain constant across cultures and eras. In the same way, a great painting reveals the emotional and psychological core of the human experience. A Renaissance depiction of the Madonna and Child, for example, transcends time and context. It touches something deeply familiar, a universal vision of maternal care and spiritual connection that speaks just as clearly now as it did centuries ago. Through these visual arts, we move beyond the surface of appearances to glimpse the eternal truths embedded in human nature. Poetry and literature, speaking the soul's language. Poetry and literature elevate the experience further by engaging directly with thought, language, and conceptual understanding. These arts do not rely on physical forms or images. Instead, they express what cannot be seen: emotions, philosophies, and inner truths. Great poetry captures profound emotional and existential insights in language that resonates across time. When we read a truly moving verse, we often discover feelings we've known all our lives, but never had the words to express: love, grief, beauty, mortality, longing. Literature, especially in its most refined forms, explores the full complexity of human behavior and social interaction. Works like Shakespeare's dramas or Dostoevsky's novels reveal underlying patterns of personality, fate, and moral struggle. They help us understand not just others, but ourselves, illuminating what is universal beneath the ever-shifting details of culture and circumstance. Music, the pure voice of the will. Among all art forms, Schopenhauer held music in the highest regard. Unlike painting or poetry, music does not portray specific objects or convey defined concepts. It transcends representation entirely, offering us direct access to the inner workings of the will, the primal force driving all existence. In music, we feel the pulse of life itself: struggle, resolution, tension, release. These aren't just aesthetic effects, but echoes of the deep, unconscious patterns that shape all reality. Music doesn't need to be explained to be understood. It bypasses logic and speaks directly to our inner being. Every musical element corresponds to a layer of existence. The bass line mirrors the most basic, grounding forces, like gravity in architecture. The inner harmonies evoke the rich diversity of plant and animal life. The melody, with its emotional nuance and expressive freedom, reflects human consciousness. Together, these elements create a dynamic interplay of harmony and dissonance, echoing the eternal conflict and cooperation among different grades of being. In this way, music doesn't just represent life, it is life, experienced through sound rather than sight or thought. Schopenhauer's theory positions the arts as a hierarchical path from the material to the metaphysical, from the weight-bearing beauty of buildings to the sublime wordless truth expressed through music. Each form allows us to penetrate deeper into the nature of reality, drawing us closer to the essence of existence. Art, in all its forms, becomes not just a reflection of the world, but a revelation of what lies beyond it. The transformative power of aesthetic experience. Aesthetic experience offers a rare but genuine reprieve from the suffering that often defines our everyday mental state. In those brief moments of deep contemplation, whether inspired by art, nature, or music, we are lifted out of the habitual patterns that dominate our consciousness. The usual pull of desires fades. Anxiety about the future, comparison with others, and personal striving all momentarily fall away. What replaces them is a sense of peace that is both self-sufficient and complete, a kind of inner stillness that requires nothing more to be whole. This sense of peace does not arise because we have achieved what we desire, but because we have momentarily transcended the entire framework of desire itself. Through aesthetic awareness, we catch a glimpse of what it might mean to exist free from the relentless drive of craving and unmet needs. It is a consciousness no longer tethered to personal will, no longer dictated by longing or lack. In this state, we find temporary liberation, an opening into a mode of being that is otherwise obscured by the pressures of our daily striving. Yet for all its depth, Schopenhauer reminds us that aesthetic experience remains fleeting. It cannot permanently release us from the burdens of ordinary life. Sooner or later, we are pulled back into the world of practical concerns and individual suffering. The person who momentarily forgets their hunger while gazing at a painting will inevitably feel it again. The one who feels calm while listening to a moving symphony will eventually find their worries returning. Aesthetic contemplation points us toward the possibility of a more radical liberation, but it is not itself the endpoint. It reveals what freedom from desire could look like, but it cannot sustain that freedom. For true and lasting release from suffering, Schopenhauer argues that a more profound transformation is required, one rooted in ethical insight and culminating in the renunciation of the will to live. Even so, the value of aesthetic experience should not be dismissed. It holds intrinsic worth as an experience of clarity and beauty. More than that, it serves as a preparation, a glimpse into deeper dimensions of consciousness that may, eventually, lead to true liberation from the cycles of desire and suffering. Part 3. Ethics and Compassion. Schopenhauer's Ethical Vision. Arthur Schopenhauer's ethical philosophy is a direct extension of his metaphysical insights, particularly his conviction that the self is an illusion, and that all living beings are unified through a single underlying will. Once we accept that individual separateness is a deceptive appearance, the ethical implications become profound. To harm another is, in essence, to harm oneself. Compassion, the root of morality. For Schopenhauer, compassion is not a moral ideal we must strive to meet, nor a religious obligation imposed by divine command or societal norms. Rather, it arises naturally and spontaneously when we penetrate the illusion of separateness, what he calls Maya, and come to recognize others as expressions of the same fundamental essence that constitutes our own being. This view recasts morality not as a system of duties or laws, but as the organic result of genuine insight. True ethical conduct, then, is not imposed externally. It emerges from a deeper understanding of reality, a natural and radical ethics. Schopenhauer's ethical system is more naturalistic and in many ways more radical than traditional moral frameworks. He grounds morality in direct experience rather than abstract reasoning or codified rules. At its core lies an intuitive awareness. The pain of another being is as real, as immediate, and as meaningful as our own. This realization is not something we arrive at through logical argument or philosophical debate. One cannot be reasoned or coerced into genuine compassion. It cannot be mandated through law or enforced by the fear of punishment. The moment of compassion. Compassion is born in a moment of insight, when the boundary between the self and the other dissolves. In that instant, we feel the other's suffering as if it were our own, not metaphorically, but directly. In such moments, the question, "Why should I care about others?" becomes irrelevant, just as we do not need to ask why we should care about ourselves. The caring is automatic. This response is not cultivated through effort or duty. It is immediate, undeniable, and deeply human. When the illusion of separateness fades, compassion naturally takes its place. Justice and loving kindness, virtues of compassion. From this awakened understanding, Schopenhauer identifies two key moral virtues: justice and loving kindness. Justice means refraining from causing harm to others, not because we fear consequences or wish to uphold social order, but because we recognize that their suffering is indistinguishable from our own. Once we fully grasp the shared nature of suffering, the desire to hurt others simply vanishes. Moral rules become unnecessary because the motivation to act unjustly is gone. The person who lives from this perspective does not practice fairness out of obligation. They act justly because injustice appears irrational. It no longer aligns with their expanded understanding of reality. They have seen through the illusion that separates self from other, and thus the motives for cruelty or exploitation lose their grip. Beyond justice, the power of loving kindness. Where justice tells us to avoid harm, loving kindness urges us to do good. It is not merely a passive virtue, but an active one, an impulse to ease suffering, to nurture, to uplift. A person who experiences others as integral parts of their own nature cannot help but wish for their well-being. Helping others is no longer viewed as a sacrifice. It becomes a fulfillment of one's own deeper nature. Their happiness and our happiness are seen not as two competing interests, but as parts of a shared whole, the illusion of selflessness. This kind of altruism requires no denial of self-interest. On the contrary, it is a form of enlightened self-interest, a recognition that what benefits another also contributes to the well-being of the one unified will that expresses itself through all beings. What looks like selfless generosity is, in truth, an act of wisdom, a reflection of someone who understands the deep unity that lies beneath all apparent diversity. Schopenhauer on the failure of traditional ethical systems. Traditional systems of ethics, as critiqued by Arthur Schopenhauer, are inherently flawed because they seek to enforce moral behavior through external motivations rather than through a deep transformation of consciousness. Religious moral frameworks, for instance, motivate good behavior by promising heavenly rewards or threatening eternal punishment. Utilitarianism suggests we should act in ways that maximize overall happiness for the greatest number of people. The limits of external moral motivation. From a utilitarian perspective, we are morally obligated to choose actions that generate the most beneficial consequences for society. Similarly, Kantian ethics posits that we have a rational duty to treat every individual with inherent dignity, independent of our personal preferences. Despite their differences, these approaches share a common assumption. Moral behavior often conflicts with our self-interest and must be upheld by appealing to a higher ideal or authority. Schopenhauer, however, fundamentally disagreed. Why external rewards undermine true morality? He argued that genuine ethical action cannot arise from motives tied to reward or punishment, no matter how noble they may seem. If someone helps others only because they expect divine compensation, they are still operating from self-interest, albeit in a more calculated and long-term way. Likewise, if one sacrifices personal well-being to promote collective happiness, this kind of moral heroism, while admirable, is often unsustainable and rare. Even someone who acts morally out of pure respect for rational principles, as Kant demands, must constantly suppress their natural desires, creating a deep inner tension between what they want and what they ought to do. This constant struggle renders moral behavior burdensome, artificial, and ultimately unstable. The need for an inner ethical awakening. Schopenhauer believed that morality could only become genuine and enduring when it emerged from a transformation in how we perceive the world and ourselves. Only by dissolving the illusion of separateness, what he referred to as Maya, can moral behavior become spontaneous, effortless, and truly compassionate. When we no longer see ourselves as fundamentally isolated beings, but instead recognize our unity with all life, compassion arises naturally. It is no longer forced or regulated by duty or consequence. It flows directly from our deepest nature. A vision of universal compassion. Schopenhauer's ethical insights led him to become one of the earliest Western philosophers to seriously champion animal rights and environmental consciousness. If compassion stems from the ability to understand suffering, then it should not be restricted to human beings alone. Animals, too, feel pain, fear, hunger, and frustration. Their capacity to suffer gives them a valid and morally significant claim to our compassion. That animals may lack abstract reasoning or the ability to build civilizations does not diminish the reality or the importance of their suffering. Transcending the illusion of separation. For Schopenhauer, the truly awakened individual sees all sentient beings, human or animal, as expressions of the same underlying will, the metaphysical force at the heart of existence. Such an individual doesn't need to be told to care. Compassion becomes a natural extension of their own being. Every creature capable of desire, satisfaction, or suffering becomes part of their moral universe. A radical ethical expansion. In Schopenhauer's era, this view was revolutionary, and even today, it remains challenging. While many people feel instinctive empathy for others who resemble them culturally or socially, it takes a deeper moral insight to feel genuine compassion for those who differ from us in significant ways. Extending compassion to animals, however, requires an even more profound shift. A true transcendence of ego and personal bias. Schopenhauer went so far as to suggest that one's sensitivity to animal suffering is a more accurate reflection of moral maturity than adherence to traditional moral codes. An ethical standard beyond convention. To recognize and respond to the suffering of non-human creatures is to transcend cultural norms and social conditioning. It requires the courage to go beyond the boundaries of what society deems respectable and to see all life through the lens of shared being. For Schopenhauer, such compassion marks the true summit of ethical development. The nature of true compassion in Schopenhauer's philosophy. Distinguishing real compassion from emotional display. Arthur Schopenhauer made a critical distinction between authentic compassion and superficial emotionalism. He warned that what often passes as concern for others can, in reality, be a disguised form of manipulation. Some individuals claim to care deeply, but their concern serves more to influence outcomes in their favor than to alleviate real suffering. Others respond with visible distress when confronted with pain, but this reaction often reflects a desire to showcase their own moral sensitivity, not to assist those in need. Compassion measured by action, not emotion. According to Schopenhauer, true compassion is not defined by dramatic emotional displays, but by quiet, purposeful action. The genuinely compassionate person asks not how to express their feelings, but how to effectively address another's needs. They seek tangible ways to provide relief without needing recognition or gratitude. Their help is often invisible, offered with humility, without grand gestures or self-congratulation. Seeing through illusion, ethics, justice, and punishment, Schopenhauer's metaphysical concept of Maya, the illusion of separateness, has profound implications for how we view justice and punishment. If the boundaries between individuals are ultimately illusory, then the urge for revenge begins to lose its appeal. While harmful behavior must still be addressed and social stability demands consequences, the emotional need to retaliate becomes less compelling. Justice is practical necessity, not moral retribution. Punishment, then, is not about settling cosmic scores. It's a tool to uphold social cooperation, not a moral crusade to inflict suffering in return. This viewpoint encourages a more level-headed, pragmatic approach to law and policy, one that prioritizes prevention and rehabilitation over revenge and moral judgment. The rarity of spontaneous compassion. Despite the power of these insights, Schopenhauer acknowledged that few reach the level of awareness required for spontaneous, unconditional compassion. Most people live their entire lives firmly rooted in the illusion of separateness, offering kindness only when there's something to gain. Even those who intellectually grasp the illusory nature of individuality usually continue to act as though their ego boundaries are real. Breaking the illusion, grace over effort, transcending the illusion of self versus other, is not something one can force. It arises in rare moments of insight or grace, experiences that dissolve the walls of ego and reveal a deeper unity. Because such moments are so rare, Schopenhauer argued, society must rely on conventional moral systems, rules, punishments, and social incentives. Morality as a means, not an end. However, these systems are merely provisional. They are not the ultimate foundation of ethics, but practical measures to preserve social harmony in the absence of widespread spiritual insight. They serve a function, but they are not the final word on morality. Part 4. The Rejection of the Will to Live. According to Arthur Schopenhauer, the highest state a human being can attain, and the ultimate remedy to life's inherent suffering, is the total renunciation of the will to live. This isn't merely a shift in attitude or behavior, it's a profound metamorphosis of consciousness itself. This state is characterized by a complete absence of personal cravings, ambitions, or attachments to existence. It's essential to understand that Schopenhauer did not equate this with suicide. In fact, he saw suicide as a tragic misunderstanding, a desperate act that affirms the will even as it rejects life's current form, driven by the hope for a better one. In contrast, the true denial of the will is not an act of rebellion, but one of transcendence. Renouncing the will happens not through violence or suppression, but through a quiet and gradual fading of all interest in the typical motivations that govern human life: pleasure, comfort, reputation, relationships, even survival itself. For Schopenhauer, this shift represents the greatest possible liberation from suffering. It mirrors concepts like nirvana or spiritual salvation, a state where human consciousness is finally free from the compulsions that keep it bound to pain. But such a transformation is exceedingly rare. Schopenhauer could identify only a few individuals throughout history who had fully achieved this level of detachment. The journey typically begins with a piercing realization about the nature of life, a deep recognition of the futility behind all human striving. When someone truly grasps that desire is inseparable from suffering, that satisfaction is always fleeting, and that the self is little more than a temporary illusion, they begin to lose the motivation that once drove them. They see that fulfilling desires offers no permanent contentment. Every goal achieved is merely replaced by a new one. They begin to understand that trying to defend their ego against threats or outshine others in competition is ultimately a losing game, a game with no final victory. This shift is not merely intellectual, it reaches deep into their being. The understanding is so profound that it changes the very structure of their desire. What once seemed urgent now appears trivial. The demands of the will still surface, but they no longer hold power, because the individual now sees them for what they are, empty and unworthy of pursuit. As this insight deepens, it brings about a remarkable transformation in how one relates to their own physical body. Basic needs are still met: eating, sleeping, maintaining health, but without obsession, without ego, and without the anxious clinging that once made those acts emotionally charged. Hunger is satisfied, fatigue is answered, but food and rest no longer offer the illusion of meaning. Even sexual desire, which Schopenhauer saw as the most potent expression of the will to live, fades away. This isn't repression nor a moral decision. It's not that the person chooses celibacy. Rather, celibacy chooses them. The will that once fueled such impulses simply begins to dissolve, and with it, the desires disappear naturally. This inner transformation also reshapes social relationships. As the denial of the will takes root, the individual stops caring about social competition, status, admiration, success, or being right. These things lose their appeal because the person no longer identifies with the self that benefits from such victories. Praise and criticism alike become irrelevant. Yet this detachment doesn't lead to coldness or isolation. On the contrary, it brings a serene inner peace. The person may still interact with others and offer help when needed, but no longer from a place of personal need or ego-driven motivation. Their compassion becomes entirely altruistic, not because they are striving to be virtuous, but because there is no longer a self to serve through kindness. This is the ultimate selflessness, a quiet, enduring love for others without expectation, without desire, rooted in the stillness of a will that has let go. The transcendence of will, a philosophical exploration, the futility of materialism. When a person fully renounces the will to live, material goods and worldly accomplishments lose their allure. While they may still make use of basic necessities to sustain life, the pursuit of wealth, social prestige, or ambitious goals no longer holds meaning or satisfaction. To them, enhancing the ego through external acquisitions feels as futile as rearranging furniture in a dream, ultimately irrelevant to the truth of their inner reality. The illusion of the ego. Understanding that the ego is, at its core, an illusion, leads to the realization that all efforts to serve or strengthen it are equally illusory. With this awareness comes a dramatic simplification of one's lifestyle. The drive for luxury, complexity, or status naturally fades, not out of ethical discipline, but because those pursuits have simply lost their power to attract. Fading instincts and the quieting of the self. As this detachment from the will deepens, even the instinct to survive begins to diminish. The individual doesn't actively seek death, but the desperation to cling to life, which so many possess, dissolves. It's not a symptom of depression or suicidal intent. Rather, it arises from a profound insight that renders the fear of death obsolete. Life and death become events of equal weight, neither more meaningful than the other. Death without fear. When confronted with illness or danger, such a person may take reasonable steps to avoid harm, but without the emotional urgency others often feel. The possibility of death is met with calm acceptance. It becomes just another change in the ever-shifting flow of experience, no more significant than the passing of a season. transcending the ego's final stronghold. This deep indifference to personal survival marks the final dissolution of the ego's most deeply rooted concern, the fear of non-existence. To move beyond this fear is to step entirely outside the boundaries of ego-driven life. Living examples of will denial. Philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer pointed to historical figures, primarily Christian mystics and Eastern spiritual ascetics, as examples of individuals who had achieved this complete negation of the will. Their renunciation of worldly desires wasn't born of self-discipline, but arose spontaneously from an inner transformation. Poverty, celibacy, and seclusion were not moral struggles, but natural expressions of a mind freed from craving. Asceticism without struggle. Such individuals embraced lives of austerity not because they forced themselves to resist temptation, but because their desires had already vanished. They did not flinch from suffering, for they no longer identified with the self that experiences pain. Nor did they fear death, having transcended the ego that clings to life. Their lives became a testament to what true spiritual liberation can look like, rare but real. The paradox of seeking liberation. Schopenhauer was careful to emphasize that this denial of the will cannot be achieved through force or intention. Ironically, the very effort to overcome desire is itself a form of desire, the desire to be free. As long as one is striving, one is still caught within the web of the will, a gift of insight, not a product of effort. True liberation from the will arises not from discipline or struggle, but from a sudden and total clarity about the nature of existence. When this insight becomes complete, the will loses its momentum on its own. It is not willed, it happens. This state is more of a spiritual gift than a personal achievement. Glimpses of liberation. For most, full and permanent denial of the will remains a lofty ideal rather than an attainable goal. Yet, brief moments of release are possible through deep aesthetic experiences, acts of compassion, or flashes of philosophical insight. In these moments, the hold of the ego loosens, and one glimpses what full liberation might be like. The rarity and the ideal. While only a few may ever reach this state, perhaps one in many millions, it remains an important and inspiring ideal. Its rarity doesn't diminish its value. On the contrary, it stands as the highest benchmark for human development against which all other forms of progress may be measured. The power of will denial, a path to enduring peace. Even making partial strides toward the denial of the will can profoundly lessen human suffering and foster a deeper, more authentic sense of peace and fulfillment. Schopenhauer's vision, misunderstood liberation. Arthur Schopenhauer recognized that his notion of true liberation, achieved through the renunciation of the will to live, might appear bleak or nihilistic, especially to those still invested in conventional aims and pleasures. To the everyday mind, such a rejection of worldly desire seems to strip life of its meaning and joy. Yet Schopenhauer insisted that this reaction stems from a fundamental misunderstanding, one that fails to grasp both the limits of ordinary satisfaction and the profound serenity found beyond it. The nature of desire, fleeting and restless. All worldly pleasures, Schopenhauer argued, are inherently transient. They are never free from the fear of their own loss, and they invariably give rise to new cravings, locking us into an endless loop of desire and disappointment. Each fulfilled wish is soon replaced by another, pulling us back into a cycle that offers, at best, only brief moments of contentment shadowed by constant anxiety. True peace, beyond wanting. In contrast, the peace attained through the denial of the will is not merely the absence of suffering, it is the presence of something far greater, a lasting self-sustaining fulfillment. This state of being does not rely on external validation or temporary joys. It is serene, unshakable, and complete in itself. Transcendence as the highest human achievement. Schopenhauer didn't view this transcendence as a void or a loss, but as the realization of our deepest human potential. In letting go of the will, we do not become less, we become more. What may first appear as surrender is, in truth, a profound act of liberation. It is not a retreat from life's richness, but an ascent to its highest form. Part 5. The World as Will and Representation. Arthur Schopenhauer's foundational insight. Arthur Schopenhauer's entire philosophical framework is built upon a single, groundbreaking realization, one he regarded as his most important intellectual discovery. This insight revealed that reality comprises two fundamental dimensions, both accessible to human understanding. Recognizing and grasping this dual nature of existence, Schopenhauer believed, offers profound answers to the mysteries of suffering, consciousness, and ultimate liberation. This idea served as the cornerstone of his magnum opus, The World as Will and Representation, published in 1818 when Schopenhauer was only 30 years old. Although initially overlooked by academic circles, the book would later be celebrated as one of the most significant contributions to Western philosophy. The first aspect, the world as representation. The first facet of reality, according to Schopenhauer, is what he termed the world as representation. This includes everything we perceive with our senses and conceptualize with our intellect. For instance, when you look at a tree, you observe an object with a particular form, color, and location, existing in both space and time. Similarly, when you hear music, your mind organizes sounds into rhythm, melody, and harmony that unfold over time. Even when you reflect on mathematical truths or recall memories, you are engaging with representations, mental constructions shaped by experience. All of these are part of the world as it appears to us, but Schopenhauer made a pivotal observation. This world of appearances does not arise passively. Instead, it is structured by certain fundamental organizing principles that the mind imposes upon raw sensory data. These principles are space, time, and causality. We never experience an object outside of space, an event outside of time, or an occurrence devoid of a cause. These frameworks shape the very limits of what can be perceived or known. This understanding was deeply influenced by the work of Immanuel Kant, who had argued that space, time, and causation are not objective features of the world itself. Rather, they are innate forms that the human mind uses to interpret reality. According to Kant, what we experience is not the world as it is in itself, but the world as it appears to us through these mental filters. He called this realm the phenomenal world. In contrast, the true nature of things, existing beyond the reach of perception and thought, he referred to as the noumenal world, or the thing in itself. The second aspect, the will. While Schopenhauer agreed with Kant's distinction, he claimed to have gone further. He argued that although we cannot perceive the thing in itself through our senses or logical reasoning, we do have a unique, immediate access to it through our own inner experience of willing. When you feel hunger, anger, fear, sexual desire, or any intense drive, you are not merely observing representations of these states. Rather, you are directly confronting the thing in itself, not as an external object, but as the very force that moves within you. Schopenhauer called this force the will. Importantly, he did not mean will in the ordinary sense of conscious choice. Instead, he described it as a primordial, blind, and unconscious force that underlies not only our conscious decisions, but also the involuntary processes of our bodies, our heartbeat, digestion, immune responses, and reflexes, as well as our primal instincts and desires, the craving for food, the need for shelter, the urge for connection, and the pursuit of recognition. The will, in this context, is not something you have. It is what you are, at your most essential level, beneath all the layers of identity, personality, and thought. The will as the essence of all things. Schopenhauer's insight extended well beyond human psychology. He proposed that the same will we experience within ourselves is the inner essence of all reality. The force that propels a plant towards sunlight is no different from the drive that compels you to seek nourishment. The instinct of a bird building its nest is the same energy behind your desire to establish a home. Even the gravitational pull between celestial bodies, Schopenhauer argued, reflects this same universal will. It is the cosmic echo of the same force that draws human beings toward one another. In his view, all phenomena in the universe, organic or inorganic, conscious or unconscious, are simply manifestations of a single underlying will. Though it appears in countless forms, this will is ultimately one and indivisible, expressing itself through the full spectrum of existence. The illusion of multiplicity. Schopenhauer's vision of reality. The world as we perceive it, with its countless forms, objects, and beings, may seem diverse and manifold. But according to Schopenhauer, this variety is a profound illusion, born from the structuring frameworks of space, time, and causality. These mental forms organize our experience in such a way that a singular essence appears fragmented. What we encounter as multiplicity is, in truth, a single force refracted through the lens of human perception, much like a beam of white light split into various colors by a crystal. Just as the many hues are nothing more than expressions of one light, the countless forms we observe in the world are all expressions of one fundamental reality, the will. Their separateness is a product of how our minds interpret reality, not of reality itself. The will's hierarchy of manifestation. Schopenhauer proposed that the will expresses itself across a spectrum of levels within the world of appearance. At the most basic level, it manifests as the primal forces of nature, gravity, magnetism, and the chemical attractions and repulsions that govern matter. Moving upward, the will takes shape as biological functions, growth, metabolism, reproduction. At an even higher level, it reveals itself in the instinctual behavior of animals, the pursuit of nourishment, the instinct to flee danger, the drive to reproduce, and the care of offspring. At the highest level of objectification, the will emerges as human consciousness. Here it manifests in our capacity for reason, imagination, ethical awareness, and philosophical reflection. Each level builds upon the previous ones, meaning that in human beings, the will's earlier forms still persist, enfolded within our most complex expressions. The nature of the will itself, beyond time and space. The will, in its purest form, does not exist within space or time. While its manifestations unfold within the framework of physical reality, the will itself is timeless and omnipresent. It is not confined to any specific location because it constitutes the inner essence of all things, everywhere. It has no beginning or end, because those are merely constructs of temporal perception. The will is eternal, unchanging, and universal, unified and indivisible. Although the will appears divided into individual beings and distinct phenomena, this division exists only at the level of appearance. In its essence, the will is a singular, indivisible force. The boundaries we perceive between ourselves and others, between object and subject, are ultimately artificial. They are distinctions made by our minds, not by reality. In the deepest layer of existence, there is no true separation. There is no multitude of beings, no individual selves. Only the one will expressing itself in countless forms. Blind and unconscious. The will does not possess consciousness in the way we typically understand it. It does not plan, reason, or intend. It is not intelligent or purposeful in a rational sense. Rather, it is a blind, ceaseless impulse, a force that endlessly strives, surges, and seeks manifestation. When we witness the complexity of natural systems, like the symmetry of flowers or the precision of planetary motion, we are not observing a conscious designer. We are witnessing the patterns formed by a non-conscious but powerful force, moving according to eternal laws. Ceaseless striving without fulfillment. Perhaps the most revealing trait of the will is its relentless drive, never reaching final satisfaction. No matter how much is achieved, the will immediately begins striving again. Satisfaction is always fleeting. A plant that reaches towards sunlight immediately seeks nutrients and water. An animal that feeds must quickly resume the search for safety or reproduction. Likewise, a person who attains wealth or love soon finds themselves longing for more, new desires, greater ambitions. This endless cycle, desire, momentary fulfillment, and renewed desire, reveals a profound truth: that dissatisfaction is woven into the very fabric of existence. The will cannot rest. It is compelled to strive forever, and in that striving lies the root of suffering. Conclusion: the tragic insight. Schopenhauer's philosophy offers a sobering view of existence. At its core is a force that is blind, indivisible, timeless, and unquenchable. All life, all nature, and all thought are merely reflections of this singular will. And because this will is always striving yet never satisfied, suffering is not an accidental part of life. It is essential to it. To recognize this for Schopenhauer is not merely to understand the world intellectually, but to see through its illusion. It is to awaken to the true nature of reality, where individuality dissolves, where striving never ends, and where the only possible peace may lie in transcending the will altogether. Schopenhauer and the discovery of the will, a transformation in understanding human nature. The will as the essence of reality. Schopenhauer's philosophical breakthrough, the identification of the will as the fundamental reality behind all appearances, had far-reaching implications for how we understand ourselves and the human condition. He proposed that what we conventionally regard as our personal identity is not the ultimate truth of our being. Rather, it is a fleeting illusion, a surface phenomenon generated by something far more profound. Our individual preferences, hopes, anxieties, and the feeling that we are separate from others. All of these belong not to the essence of who we are, but to the realm of representation, the world as it appears to us. The true self, unity with the universal will. At our core, Schopenhauer argued, we are not isolated selves, but expressions of a single universal will. This will pulses through all beings and underlies all phenomena. Realizing this truth marks a critical turning point in the pursuit of wisdom. Schopenhauer believed that through this recognition, we begin to understand the roots of human suffering and the path that leads beyond it. The lines we draw between ourselves and others, between subject and object, between what is personal and what is universal, these lines are not fixed. They are conceptual boundaries, not absolute realities. The ethical and emotional consequences. This insight carries immense practical significance for how we live. When you feel rivalry or resentment toward others, you are failing to see that both you and they are simply different expressions of the same primal will. When you seek fulfillment through external success, you are chasing shadows, pursuing satisfaction in the domain of appearance rather than confronting the inner truth of your nature. When you fear death, it is because you have mistakenly identified your essence with your temporary, individual form rather than with the timeless force that animates all life. When you feel disconnected or alienated, it is because you have taken the illusions of separation too seriously, treating the surface as the substance. A new way of seeing the world. Ultimately, Grasping the relationship between will and representation transforms our entire way of being. It allows us to transcend the illusions of the ego and see ourselves in continuity with all existence. This understanding becomes the bedrock of a new way to engage with life, one that does not rely on competition, fear, or desire, but on deep insight into the shared essence of all things. Part 6. The Principle of Sufficient Reason. Before Arthur Schopenhauer developed his mature philosophical system centered on will and representation, he laid its groundwork in his doctoral dissertation, which explored what he termed the principle of sufficient reason. Remarkably, he completed this foundational work at just 22 years old. This principle would become the cornerstone upon which all of his later philosophical insights rested. At its core, the principle of sufficient reason asserts that everything that exists or occurs must have a reason for being the way it is, rather than being otherwise, or not existing at all. While this might initially sound self-evident, Schopenhauer's rigorous examination revealed that it underpins the structure of all human understanding and experience in profoundly diverse ways. He identified 4 distinct forms through which the principle operates, each corresponding to a unique dimension of reality and human cognition. Schopenhauer argued that past philosophers had misunderstood or overlooked these distinctions, resulting in confusion and philosophical errors. By delineating these 4 categories, he believed he could untangle long-standing conceptual knots in the study of causality, motivation, logic, and knowledge itself. Crucially, this framework would later allow Schopenhauer to identify the limits of rational thought and to gesture toward a deeper, more fundamental reality beneath it, the realm of the will. The principle of sufficient reason of becoming. The first and most intuitive form of the principle governs how we perceive changes in the physical world. Schopenhauer called this the principle of sufficient reason of becoming. It holds that every event must have a cause that precedes it in time and explains why it happened. Take the example of a billiard ball that begins to roll after being struck by another. The motion of the second ball is not arbitrary, it's explained by the force of the impact. Or consider boiling water. The application of heat provides the necessary reason for the change in temperature and state. This form of reasoning, causal analysis, underlies all natural science. It allows us to interpret and predict physical phenomena by tracing chains of cause and effect. It is the bedrock of empirical inquiry and everyday practical knowledge. However, Schopenhauer was careful to highlight an important boundary. Causal reasoning can explain events and changes, but it cannot explain the mere existence of things themselves. For example, while we can explain why a stone falls when dropped, we cannot through causality alone explain why stones, or the physical world, exist at all. Causality links events within time, but does not reach the metaphysical question of why there is anything rather than nothing. This limitation is crucial because it demonstrates that science, no matter how advanced, can never fully resolve the ultimate questions of existence. Science can describe and predict, but not explain why reality exists in the first place. The principle of sufficient reason of knowing. The second form of the principle governs a completely different domain, reasoning and logical deduction. Schopenhauer called this the principle of sufficient reason of knowing. In this mode, a belief or conclusion must rest upon adequate logical grounds that justify its truth. In mathematics, for example, every theorem must be rigorously derived from axioms and earlier theorems using valid logical rules. Similarly, in formal reasoning, each step in an argument must logically follow from the previous ones, ensuring that if the premises are true, the conclusion must be as well. Unlike causal reasoning, this type of knowledge does not unfold in time. It is not about events causing other events, but about relationships between concepts, about meaning, implication, and structure. Schopenhauer insisted on keeping these forms of reasoning distinct because many thinkers had blurred the lines between them. For instance, a logical premise does not cause its conclusion in the way that fire causes smoke. Instead, logic articulates necessary connections between ideas, which are timeless and abstract. Consider the classic syllogism: all humans are mortal. Socrates is a human. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. This is not a narrative of events unfolding in the world, but a logical structure that reveals something essential about the relationships between concepts. It's not something we observe happening, but something we recognize as necessarily true. Understanding this distinction between empirical causal and rational logical knowledge helps us grasp how human understanding functions on multiple levels, each governed by its own principles, each with its own strengths and limitations. The principle of sufficient reason, routes 3 and 4. The third route, the principle of sufficient reason of being. The third pathway in Schopenhauer's system is the principle of sufficient reason of being, which underpins our very perception of space and time. According to this principle, every location in space and every moment in time must be understood through their relations to other locations and moments. In other words, we can only define a place by describing its spatial relationship, such as direction and distance, to other places. Likewise, a moment in time can only be determined by referencing its position within the broader temporal sequence. Time and space are not independent containers that exist on their own, waiting to be filled with events or objects. Instead, they are systems of relationships, tools our minds use to structure experiences and distinguish one object, event, or moment from another. This interpretation led Schopenhauer to align with Kant, concluding that space and time are not external realities, but rather forms of human intuition. We never perceive a thing without it appearing somewhere and sometime, because our minds impose spatiality and temporality on all sensory input. These dimensions are not discovered in the world, but constructed by our cognitive faculties. The principle of sufficient reason of being, then, explains the mental architecture that allows all perception to occur. Without this internal structure, we would be unable to tell one object from another, recognize individuals, or observe change. But it's critical to understand. This structure does not come from the outside world. We project it onto our experience. This insight is key to grasping the difference between the world as we represent it and the deeper reality Schopenhauer calls the will. The fourth route, the principle of sufficient reason of acting. The fourth route explores the principle of sufficient reason of acting, which governs human action and motivation. Under this principle, every human behavior must have a motive, some inner reason that explains why a person chose to do one thing instead of something else, or nothing at all. For instance, if someone goes to the store, it's because they were moved by a desire or need, perhaps for food, or to satisfy a craving. When a person chooses one profession over another, it's because certain factors made that path more attractive than the alternatives. By identifying these motives, we gain the ability to analyze and predict behavior, forming the basis for fields like psychology, ethics, and the social sciences. Schopenhauer pointed out that although motives function as causes in the domain of human behavior, they do not act like physical forces. Instead, they must be recognized in consciousness, perceived as either necessary or desirable, before they can prompt action. Because of this, the same external situation can lead to very different responses in different people. Imagine a thunderstorm. One person might hurry indoors, driven by discomfort or fear, while another might run outside, thrilled by the spectacle. The situation is the same, but their interpretations and inner reactions differ. The key lies not in the external event, but in how consciousness perceives and responds to it. Thus, understanding motivation involves more than just studying external conditions. It also requires examining the internal psychological landscape of the individual. Still, Schopenhauer believed that our conscious motives are not the deepest layer. While we can often identify what motivates us in the moment, we struggle to explain why we have those particular motives. A person might pursue a specific career for financial stability, but may not be able to articulate why financial stability is so important to them, especially in comparison to other goals like passion, recognition, or freedom. According to Schopenhauer, these underlying preferences and tendencies do not arise from reasoned thought, but from a deeper, unconscious force he later identifies as the will. The principle of sufficient reason of acting can map the visible chain from thought to action, but it cannot reach the mysterious source from which all true motivation flows. Transcending rational thought, Schopenhauer and the limits of representation. Beyond rational analysis, the limitations of conventional reasoning point toward the necessity for a deeper mode of understanding, one that surpasses purely analytical thought. The fourfold root of the principle of sufficient reason. Arthur Schopenhauer identified four distinct modes through which the principle of sufficient reason manifests, all confined within the realm of representation. Causality, the linkage of events across time. Logic, the connection between concepts and propositions. Spatio-temporal perception, the organization of objects in space and time. Motivation, the relationship between desires and corresponding actions. Each of these operates by relating one representation to another, following its own internal logic and structure. The barrier of representation. While these forms of reasoning enable us to comprehend the structure and interrelation of appearances, they fall short of penetrating beyond the surface. They cannot reveal the essence that lies beneath all representations, the thing in itself. We are left with an organized picture of how representations function, yet we remain without answers to fundamental questions. Why do representations exist at all? What underlies the totality of what is represented? The call for direct access to reality. To answer these deeper questions, Schopenhauer argued, we require a mode of knowing that is not mediated by representational structures. Instead, we must seek a direct, immediate apprehension of reality as it truly is, independent of space, time, and causality, establishing the limits of rational knowledge. This insight became a cornerstone of Schopenhauer's mature philosophy. It defined the boundaries of rational inquiry and marked the beginning of a more intuitive form of understanding. No matter how advanced or refined, rational knowledge remains bound within the representational world. It can categorize, analyze, and forecast within this domain, but it cannot move beyond it. The need for intuitive insight, the most profound existential concerns, questions of being, suffering, and the possibility of liberation, elude resolution through logic alone. They demand a different kind of understanding. This understanding bypasses the principle of sufficient reason and accesses reality directly. The will as the key to reality. Schopenhauer identified this direct insight with the experience of the will, a force that underlies all phenomena. Recognizing the will as the essence of existence becomes the gateway to aesthetic experience, a momentary escape from the tyranny of desire, moral awareness, empathy and compassion arising from the recognition of shared will, spiritual liberation, the transcendence of suffering through the denial of the will. Conclusion, toward a deeper understanding. Schopenhauer's philosophy invites us to confront the limits of what can be known rationally and to embrace a deeper, more intuitive path to truth, one that seeks to experience, rather than merely explain, the essence of reality. Part 7. Platonic Ideas and the Hierarchy of Objectification. Between the undifferentiated essence of will and the multifaceted world of individual beings and phenomena, Arthur Schopenhauer identified an intermediate metaphysical layer, what he termed the Platonic ideas. These ideas, adapted from the philosophy of Plato, serve as enduring blueprints or archetypes. They govern how the will becomes visible in the world as we perceive it. Understanding these ideas is central to Schopenhauer's aesthetic theory. They form the foundation of his explanation for how the artistic mind can move beyond superficial appearances to reveal universal truths. These archetypes also offer insight into the apparent harmony, beauty, and purposiveness found in nature, which arise paradoxically from a blind, irrational force, the will. According to Schopenhauer, the Platonic ideas are the direct expressions of the will. In contrast, the individual objects we encounter in time and space are only indirect expressions, shaped by the cognitive frameworks through which humans perceive reality. The ideas bypass these filters, providing a purer manifestation of the will's essence. Each idea encapsulates a fundamental mode of being, a constant, timeless pattern that governs how the will takes shape in specific phenomena. For example, the idea of gravity is not just a scientific abstraction, but an eternal form that dictates how mass behaves, from the fall of an apple to the motion of galaxies. Similarly, the idea of the rose defines the essential structure of every rose, past, present, and future, how it grows, blossoms, and reproduces. Crucially, these archetypes are not human inventions or mental constructs. They are objective structures that exist independently of human thought or experience. They do not arise from perception, but exist beyond it. Unlike the empirical world, which is constrained by time, space, and causality, the Platonic ideas exist in a timeless and unchanging realm. They are not subject to the constant flux and impermanence that characterize everyday experience. For instance, the idea of justice retains its integrity whether applied to ancient legal systems or modern democracies. Likewise, the idea of courage remains consistent, whether embodied in a medieval knight or a present-day firefighter, regardless of historical context or personal background. Because these ideas transcend spatio-temporal limitations, each instance of their appearance fully expresses the entire idea. Every rose, no matter how ordinary, is a complete embodiment of the eternal idea of the rose, not a partial or diminished version. Schopenhauer further classified the Platonic ideas into a hierarchy of objectification, representing different levels through which the will manifests itself, from the simplest to the most complex. At the base of this hierarchy lie the fundamental physical forces: gravity, electromagnetism, and the strong and weak nuclear forces. These represent the will in its most basic, unconscious form, pure striving, with no awareness or intent. A stone falling to the ground exemplifies the idea of gravity just as precisely as the orbit of a planet. Both follow unyielding physical laws without any notion of purpose or agency. Here, the will objectifies itself as natural law, laying the groundwork for more sophisticated forms of expression to emerge. This level forms the structural skeleton of reality. The next tier includes chemical forces, the principles that determine how elements combine or separate. Unlike basic physical forces, chemical interactions display a form of selectivity. For example, hydrogen and oxygen atoms combine to form water because of their particular affinities, which do not apply universally to all elements. This introduces the earliest form of differentiation in the will's expression. Though still devoid of conscious intent, these processes show the beginnings of complexity. The periodic table, in this sense, can be viewed as a catalog of the will's objectification at this level. Each element possesses a unique set of properties and behaviors that repeat consistently across the cosmos. In this way, Schopenhauer traced a developmental arc, from unconscious physical forces to the intricate patterns of life and mind, showing how the will gradually takes on more differentiated and refined forms as it ascends the hierarchy of objectification. The hierarchy of will in nature, the will in biological life. At higher levels of nature's hierarchy, the will takes form through biological systems, manifesting itself in essential life functions such as growth, nourishment, reproduction, and the capacity to adapt. These forces drive living beings in ways that suggest direction and purpose. Consider the plant. Though rooted and lacking awareness, it exhibits behavior that seems intentional. It stretches toward light, burrows its roots toward moisture and nutrients, and synchronizes its organs to ensure survival and reproduction. Yet, despite this apparent intentionality, plants remain unconscious. They do not possess awareness of their surroundings or their internal states. Rather, they operate through deeply embedded instinctual patterns, a more refined expression of the will than in mere inorganic matter, but still devoid of cognition. The emergence of animal consciousness. The leap from plant life to animal life marks a profound evolution in the objectification of the will. Animals not only perform basic biological functions, but also experience the world through conscious perception. They form mental representations, learn from experiences, and adjust their actions accordingly. A dog, for example, recognizes its owner, recalls the location of hidden food, and reacts emotionally, expressing happiness, fear, or aggression. This level of consciousness grants animals a flexible, responsive connection to their environment. However, it also opens the door to suffering. An animal can long for something beyond its reach, relive past traumas, and fear anticipated dangers. The presence of memory and foresight allows not just for survival, but also for emotional turmoil. Human consciousness, the pinnacle of objectification. Among all known forms of life, human beings represent the most complex manifestation of the will. We inherit all the traits of animal consciousness, but also possess uniquely human faculties: abstract reasoning, philosophical reflection, symbolic language, creativity, and the capacity to imagine non-existent scenarios. We can envision possible futures, learn from history, and construct elaborate social and cultural systems that endure across generations. But this elevated awareness carries a heavy burden. No other creature experiences pain in the anticipatory or reflective ways that humans do. Our ability to compare our lives to idealized versions or to those of others often breeds dissatisfaction, anxiety, and existential dread. The interwoven layers of human nature. Schopenhauer emphasized that every higher expression of the will includes and builds upon the lower ones. A human being is not solely a conscious mind. We are also composed of the same physical, chemical, and biological forces that govern all lower forms of existence. Gravity pulls on us. Our bodies rely on biochemical processes, and our organs function according to the same principles that govern plant life. Human consciousness is not a replacement for these layers, but an addition to them. As a result, human nature is inherently fragmented and conflicted. We are simultaneously animals with instinctual drives and abstract thinkers plagued by intangible concerns. We feel hunger and fatigue, yet also wrestle with questions of identity, purpose, and morality, burdens that animals do not bear. The struggle between competing ideas. Each level of will's manifestation operates through distinct ideas, and these ideas are constantly contending with one another for control over matter and energy. This perpetual competition is at the root of conflict, struggle, and violence throughout the natural world. Species vie for food, Predators hunt prey, and parasites thrive at the expense of their hosts. Even within individual organisms, inner turmoil emerges as competing drives collide. A person might crave indulgent food while also striving to stay healthy. They may chase career ambitions while longing for family time, or seek adventure while fearing risk. These conflicts are not incidental. They arise because the will has projected itself in diverse and often contradictory forms within a single being. Beyond conflict, Schopenhauer's vision of will and aesthetic transcendence. The inescapable nature of conflict. There is no ultimate authority capable of permanently resolving the fundamental tensions embedded in reality. These conflicts are not accidental or superficial. They are intrinsic to the very nature of existence itself. Ideas in harmony, the Schopenhauerian perspective. While Arthur Schopenhauer acknowledged the inevitability of conflict in the realm of experience, he also emphasized that the ideas, or Platonic archetypes, exist in a state of perfect equilibrium beyond the constraints of time and space. The discord arises only when these timeless ideas are expressed within the domain of representation, the phenomenal world, where individuals, bound by their subjectivity and desires, must compete over finite resources. The will and its manifestations. In their eternal and ideal form, the ideas do not oppose one another. Instead, they interrelate and reinforce each other, forming a comprehensive system that articulates every possible way the will can manifest itself in the material world. This interconnection reveals the will's complete range of expressions, not as chaotic impulses, but as an intelligible structure of meaning and potentiality. Aesthetic experience, transcending the individual will. This philosophical insight becomes especially profound when applied to aesthetic experience. In moments of genuine artistic contemplation, consciousness can rise above its personal desires and momentarily detach from the will-driven perspective. During these rare intervals, one perceives the ideas directly and disinterestedly, free from the usual demands of ego, ambition, or suffering, glimpsing a higher reality. Through aesthetic vision, we are offered not only a brief respite from the turmoil of everyday existence, but also a preview of a deeper reality, one untouched by conflict, rivalry, or pain. It is a realm where all forms of existence coexist harmoniously, unburdened by the striving inherent in individual will. Toward liberation, such experiences hint at a more profound form of freedom, the possibility of complete liberation through the denial of the will. In this ultimate act of transcendence, the suffering born of conflict is not merely avoided, it is rendered irrelevant. What remains is a serene awareness of a world where peace, unity, and understanding prevail. Part 8. The nature of human suffering and pessimism. Arthur Schopenhauer crafted one of the most profound and unrelenting examinations of human suffering ever articulated in philosophy. In his view, suffering isn't incidental, avoidable, or something humanity can outgrow through technological or societal advancements. Rather, it is deeply embedded in the structure of existence itself. At the heart of Schopenhauer's thinking is the concept of the will, a blind, insatiable force that underlies all life. Suffering, he argued, emerges unavoidably from the workings of this will, especially as it expresses itself through conscious beings like us. This insight led him to a bleak yet coherent philosophical stance known as pessimism, the belief that life is inherently filled with more pain than joy, more unrest than peace, more dissatisfaction than fulfillment. According to Schopenhauer, the root of suffering lies in the act of willing itself. To will something is to yearn for what one does not yet have. It is to stretch toward an unmet goal, driven by a sense of absence or incompleteness. Every act of willing begins with a fundamental lack. Hunger arises from the absence of food, loneliness from the absence of companionship, poverty from the absence of financial resources. Thus, desire originates from a state of deficiency, pushing us towards something we believe will fulfill us. Yet, this state of lack is immediate and deeply felt, while the relief that follows satisfaction is usually brief, uncertain, and often disappointing. Schopenhauer noted that the majority of our lives are spent in this state of yearning, rather than in the brief moments of fulfillment. We hunger more than we feast. We crave connection more than we enjoy intimacy. We stress about money more than we freely spend it. And even when our most urgent needs are met, new desires rush in to take their place. Consider someone who achieves financial stability. Soon they may begin to crave social admiration. Once admired, they might set their sights on influence or control. A person who falls in love may find themselves haunted by the fear of loss. The will, in Schopenhauer's view, produces an endless cascade of desires, ensuring that our lives are dominated by longing and dissatisfaction. When satisfaction arrives, it's fleeting, soon displaced by new cravings. Worse still, those rare moments when we do get what we want often come with their own set of problems. The reality of fulfillment rarely matches the ideal we imagine during the pursuit. A dream job might reveal itself to be filled with monotonous tasks we hadn't anticipated. The person we pursued romantically might show traits that were invisible during the early stages of affection. Even objects of desire, the things we work and save for, often lose their appeal quickly after we acquire them. A new gadget or luxury item becomes ordinary once it's in our possession. What's more, reaching a goal often removes the very sense of purpose that gave our striving its meaning. We discover, to our dismay, that the chase itself was more energizing than the capture. In many cases, success leads not to joy but to a void. We ask ourselves, what now? This realization led Schopenhauer to describe human life as constantly swinging between two poles, desire and boredom. When we don't have what we want, we suffer due to lack. But once we possess it, we quickly grow bored. There is no lasting state of peace between these extremes. The will ensures that we are either aching for something more or feeling restless with what we have. Even those who seem to have it all, celebrities, tycoons, or political leaders, are not immune. In fact, they often report high levels of anxiety, depression, and inner emptiness. External achievements, no matter how grand, cannot dismantle the underlying machinery of the will that produces suffering in the first place. Schopenhauer also identified other ways the will distorts our experience of reality. One major consequence is that intense desire leads us to idealize what we want. We focus obsessively on its appealing traits and ignore or downplay its drawbacks. We convince ourselves that acquiring this object or outcome will solve our problems and bring lasting happiness, expectations that reality almost always fails to meet. This distortion works both ways. When we dread something, we exaggerate its negative aspects and underestimate our resilience to deal with it. Whether longing for gain or fearing loss, the will clouds our judgment and sets us up for continual disappointment. The roots of human suffering, a Schopenhauerian perspective. The competitive nature of desire. A significant source of human suffering arises from the inherently competitive structure of desire. Most of the things we long for, status, wealth, recognition, are limited in availability. This scarcity means that success often comes at someone else's expense. There are only so many top positions, only a finite supply of coveted resources, and only so much admiration to go around. As a result, we begin to see others not as allies, but as obstacles. Their success threatens our own ambitions, and we may even find ourselves secretly wishing for their downfall. We experience envy when others achieve what we desire, and we feel unsettled or inadequate in the face of their accomplishments. This dynamic turns us against one another, undermining our capacity for genuine friendship, love, and long-term collaboration. The hedgehog dilemma, social suffering. Human relationships, too, become a source of suffering, what Schopenhauer termed the hedgehog dilemma. Just as hedgehogs huddle for warmth in winter but hurt each other with their spines when they get too close, we yearn for intimacy but are inevitably harmed by it. We crave understanding and emotional connection, yet simultaneously desire autonomy and personal space. We want to be deeply known and unconditionally loved, yet we resist full exposure and seek to maintain control over how we're perceived. These opposing needs create unavoidable friction in all relationships. We suffer in solitude, yet too much closeness brings conflict, irritation, and disappointment. The instability of human connection makes enduring harmony nearly impossible. Consciousness and temporal suffering. Another dimension of suffering unique to humans comes from our ability to think abstractly and reflect across time. Unlike animals, whose suffering is rooted in immediate physical discomfort, human beings are tormented by memory and anticipation. We dwell on humiliating experiences from the past, worry about uncertainties decades into the future, and ruminate on missed opportunities. Our minds are capable of revisiting pain that has long since passed and imagining sorrows that may never come. This ability to envision alternate lives or better outcomes often leads to chronic dissatisfaction, even when life is objectively good. A successful person might still feel empty by comparing themselves to someone more accomplished or imagining how life could have unfolded with better choices. Every minor failure has the potential to become a lasting source of anguish. The weight of abstract thought. Our intellectual capacities also expose us to unique, purely human forms of suffering. We grapple with questions of meaning, morality, and mortality, realities that animals are mercifully spared. We worry about whether our lives have purpose, wrestle with the awareness that we will one day die, and bear the heavy responsibility of ethical decision-making. We invent ideals about how life should be and then suffer when reality fails to live up to those standards. We construct intricate belief systems, political, philosophical, spiritual, and feel profound distress when these frameworks are challenged or dismissed by others. Unlike animals, who may feel fear, pain, or hunger, humans alone endure guilt, shame, existential despair, and the torment of unrealized potential. A unique vulnerability. Ironically, the very faculties that make life rich and meaningful, our imagination, empathy, and self-awareness, also make us exceptionally vulnerable to deeper, more complex forms of suffering. Schopenhauer's path to liberation. Despite painting a bleak portrait of human existence, Schopenhauer was not advocating hopelessness. His pessimism was diagnostic, not defeatist. He believed that only by fully acknowledging the pervasiveness and inevitability of suffering could we begin to move toward real solutions. Most efforts to eliminate suffering, he argued, are doomed because they rely on false hope. They assume suffering stems from external conditions that can be fixed, rather than from the internal mechanisms of desire and willing that shape our entire experience of life. Only through a clear understanding of why typical approaches to happiness fail can we begin to see the value in alternative paths, ones rooted not in striving, but in transcendence. For Schopenhauer, these alternatives included the sublime escape of aesthetic experience, the moral clarity found in ethical insight, and ultimately, the radical transformation found in the denial of the will to live. His pessimism served not as a conclusion, but as a gateway to profound healing. Part 9. Genius, talent, and intellectual capacity. The nature of genius in Schopenhauer's philosophy. Arthur Schopenhauer proposed a unique perspective on genius, viewing it not as mere intelligence or technical ability, but as a profound capacity to transcend everyday, ego-centered awareness. For Schopenhauer, the genius possesses a rare vision, an ability to perceive eternal truths that lie beyond the veil of personal interest and fleeting concerns. Transcending the ego, the core of creative brilliance. What distinguishes truly gifted individuals, according to Schopenhauer, is their ability to detach from the narrow focus of self and immerse themselves in pure contemplation. This detachment enables them to create philosophical insights, artistic works, and literary masterpieces that resonate on a universal level. Their creations communicate truths that are typically obscured by the distractions of ordinary life. This isn't simply a matter of being smart or skilled. Rather, genius involves a transformation of consciousness, a momentary release from the demands of individual desire, allowing for an unclouded perception of reality. The dual nature of genius, insight and isolation. Understanding genius in this way also sheds light on a common paradox. The tension between the extraordinary creativity of such individuals and the deep sense of alienation or suffering they often experience. Schopenhauer's insights clarify why society frequently struggles to understand, let alone embrace, those who possess this heightened awareness. Seeing the universal in the particular. The fundamental trait of genius, Schopenhauer asserts, is an uncommon ability to discern universal truths rather than remain fixated on personal needs and daily concerns. Most people interact with the world in terms of utility, what benefits or threatens them. They are absorbed by what serves their goals and often overlook anything lacking immediate relevance. In contrast, the genius can become entirely engrossed in observing an object or contemplating an idea, forgetting themselves in the process. Their attention shifts away from the immediate and practical toward the eternal and abstract. In doing so, they perceive patterns and principles that are invisible to the practically minded. Artistic genius, capturing the eternal in the ephemeral. This unique perceptual ability is central to artistic genius. A true artist doesn't merely reproduce the superficial appearance of a scene or a subject. Instead, they capture the essence, the enduring forms and archetypes that particular instances merely represent. When we gaze upon a powerful portrait, we're not just seeing an individual's likeness. We're witnessing qualities that transcend time and place: strength, sorrow, dignity, wisdom, vulnerability. Similarly, in a masterfully painted landscape, the viewer experiences more than a specific location. The artwork reveals the eternal ideas of nature itself: mountain, sky, forest, water, elements that evoke meaning across cultures and eras. The veil of individuation, piercing through to universal truths. Artistic genius, then, involves a rare vision that pierces the illusion of separateness. The artist perceives unity behind diversity, essence beneath form. Their works endure because they articulate something permanent about human character and the natural world, beyond the limitations of time, culture, or circumstance. Literary genius, human nature in dramatic form. In literature, genius manifests in a different medium but serves a similar purpose. Through language and storytelling, the great writer unveils the structures of human psychology, ethical struggle, and interpersonal dynamics. Figures like Shakespeare or Dostoevsky do not merely invent characters. They breathe life into timeless human archetypes. Characters such as Hamlet, Lady Macbeth, or Raskolnikov are vivid, unique individuals, but they also reflect universal patterns. We see ambition and guilt, internal conflict, and moral ambiguity, not just in them, but in ourselves. Great literature enables this recognition by dramatizing what often lies hidden: our deeper drives, repressed desires, and unspoken fears. A mirror and a revelation, the power of literature. In this way, literary genius plays a dual role. It enchants through beauty and narrative, but it also educates. It challenges readers to see beyond surface appearances, to confront aspects of their own nature that might otherwise remain buried. By exposing the psychological and moral realities we often evade, great literature fosters not only aesthetic appreciation, but also personal growth and ethical reflection. The nature of philosophical genius. True philosophical brilliance is marked by an extraordinary ability to move beyond commonly accepted beliefs and superficial appearances, reaching into the foundational truths that structure existence itself. While most individuals are content to live within the boundaries of cultural norms and inherited values, rarely questioning their origin or justification, the philosophical mind is driven by an urgent need to uncover deeper truths. Such minds are not satisfied with the status quo. Instead, they feel an unrelenting urge to pose profound questions about the nature of reality, the limits of knowledge, the basis of morality, and the meaning of life. They follow these questions with uncompromising honesty, no matter how unsettling or isolating the answers might be. Throughout history, thinkers like Plato, Kant, and Schopenhauer have redefined our understanding of these foundational issues. They didn't simply refine previous ideas. They introduced revolutionary perspectives that challenged assumptions previously taken for granted or insufficiently explored. These philosophers construct new conceptual models that bring clarity to aspects of human experience that were once misunderstood or entirely overlooked. In doing so, they often expose how misleading everyday perceptions and beliefs can be. Yet, as Schopenhauer pointed out, the path of genius is rarely an easy one. This level of insight often comes at a personal cost. The philosophical genius is typically ill-suited to the demands of ordinary life. While most people are occupied with immediate goals and social advancement, the genius is engrossed in abstract contemplation and universal truths. As a result, practical concerns, such as health, financial stability, and personal relationships, are frequently neglected. What seems trivial to them may, in fact, be crucial in everyday life. Their broader vision often makes them critical of social norms and institutions that others accept without reflection. This nonconformity can lead to tension with family, peers, and those in positions of authority who see innovation as a threat rather than a virtue. Furthermore, the same heightened awareness that fuels creativity and insight also increases sensitivity to life's suffering. The genius perceives both the beauty and the pain of existence with greater intensity, making them more susceptible to emotional and existential struggles. Schopenhauer drew a clear line between talent and genius, though he acknowledged how difficult it can be to distinguish the two in practice. Talent, he argued, reflects exceptional ability within existing systems, whether that means mastering a musical instrument, conducting scientific research, or writing compelling narratives using established techniques. Talented individuals achieve excellence by navigating within frameworks that society already recognizes and values. A skilled pianist can perform a technically demanding composition with precision. A competent scientist may design complex experiments to test known theories. A gifted novelist might tell a gripping story using familiar forms of storytelling. Genius, on the other hand, does not merely excel within pre-existing boundaries. It breaks through them entirely. It introduces ideas, forms, and methods that no one had previously envisioned. Genius creates the map, while talent follows it. This distinction also helps explain why genuine genius is often overlooked or even rejected during the individual's lifetime. Social systems are built to identify and reward talent because it contributes to well-understood objectives. Genius, by contrast, disrupts these systems by offering what cannot yet be measured or fully understood. The works of genius may appear confusing, unsettling, or irrelevant to their contemporaries, simply because the world has not yet developed the tools or mindset to grasp their significance. Only with time, when new evaluative frameworks emerge, does society begin to appreciate the true value of these contributions. That is why so many of the greatest artists, writers, and philosophers only receive recognition after death. Their contemporaries celebrated those who fit the mold, while the visionaries were left in obscurity until the world caught up to what they had seen all along. Genius and madness, Schopenhauer's perspective, two diverging paths from ordinary consciousness. Arthur Schopenhauer explored the intricate relationship between genius and madness, noting that both states reflect departures from the typical way we experience the world. Yet, while they may appear similar in their deviation from normality, Schopenhauer emphasized a crucial distinction. They move in entirely opposite directions. Madness, the trap of obsession. In cases of madness, the mind becomes consumed by particular thoughts, memories, or perceptions. This overwhelming fixation detaches the individual from shared external reality. The person becomes locked within a private mental world, unable to engage meaningfully with others or with the broader truths of existence. In essence, madness is a deep inward spiral, an intensification of subjectivity that isolates the person from common experience. Genius, transcending the self toward truth. Genius, by contrast, represents a rare capacity to rise above personal preoccupations. The genius is not driven by narrow interests or ego-based concerns. Instead, they achieve a level of objectivity that allows them to perceive universal truths, insights that resonate across time and culture, even if they are not immediately accessible to everyone. A shared departure, a divergent outcome. While both genius and madness diverge from the norms of everyday consciousness and social behavior, their outcomes are radically different. Madness draws the individual deeper into subjective isolation, often leading to turmoil and suffering. Genius, however, opens a path toward universality and enduring value. This fundamental difference explains why genius leaves behind profound contributions to art, science, and philosophy, whereas madness rarely produces more than confusion or pain. The rarity of genius and its origins. True genius is extraordinarily rare, and this rarity reflects the profound transformation of consciousness it requires. Most individuals spend their lives immersed in personal desires, goals, and ego-driven concerns. They remain rooted in what Schopenhauer called individual willing, unable to rise above their immediate interests, a unique combination of qualities. To break free from this limited perspective, even temporarily, demands a rare blend of intellectual brilliance, emotional detachment, and spiritual insight. Such a shift enables the person to contemplate universal realities with clarity and depth. Schopenhauer saw this transformation not as a fleeting moment, but as a sustained mode of awareness, one that supports creative and philosophical achievement over time. Genius as a gateway to higher consciousness. In Schopenhauer's view, the presence of genius often signals deeper forms of spiritual evolution. It may even serve as preparation for the ultimate human accomplishment, the renunciation of individual will. The ability to produce universal works of art or thought requires the person to leave behind egoic concerns and, in doing so, move closer to the highest possible state of being, total transcendence of the self. Schopenhauer's analysis highlights a compelling truth. Both madness and genius challenge conventional consciousness. but only genius ascends toward a broader, more objective understanding of reality. It is through this ascent that the genius not only illuminates timeless truths, but also lays the foundation for humanity's highest spiritual achievements. Part 10. Political Philosophy and Social Critique. Arthur Schopenhauer's political philosophy is rooted in his unique conception of human nature, one he viewed as fundamentally shaped by the relentless and irrational drive of the will. Unlike those thinkers who believed that political and social issues could be solved through better systems, education, or economic reforms, Schopenhauer saw such efforts as ultimately futile. He maintained that the very structure of human consciousness inevitably leads to conflict and inequality. In contrast to the optimistic visions of liberalism, which champion progress through reason and democratic participation, and the radical promises of socialism, which sought to usher in equality through economic upheaval, Schopenhauer offered a sobering alternative. He believed the best any political system could do was to limit harm and preserve basic social order, never to eradicate the suffering inherent in the human condition. His political stance was conservative in that it rejected utopian ideals, yet deeply humanitarian in its aim to reduce avoidable suffering. This fusion of pessimistic realism with moral compassion shaped a political outlook that would go on to influence later thinkers, even as it remained outside both progressive and reactionary mainstreams. At the core of Schopenhauer's political analysis is the idea that individuals are isolated beings, each driven by their own will, locked in competition over scarce resources. While philosophy might unveil the deeper illusion of this separateness, most people remain bound to the viewpoint of the ego, especially in political life. Driven by self-interest, individuals naturally prioritize the well-being of themselves, their families, and their communities, often to the detriment of others vying for the same limited opportunities. This inherent rivalry generates political conflict that cannot be resolved through education or systemic reform alone. Even those who intellectually grasp the value of cooperation and mutual aid often struggle to act on these ideals when faced with personal stakes. The reality is that self-preservation tends to override principle, especially when one's own safety or that of loved ones is perceived to be at risk. For Schopenhauer, this meant that any viable political structure must reflect human nature as it is, not as idealists wish it to be. This understanding led him to endorse a constitutional monarchy as the most stable form of governance. In his view, assigning ultimate authority to a monarch, someone standing above partisan divisions, could offer the kind of steady leadership and impartiality that democratic systems frequently lacked. Yet Schopenhauer did not advocate absolute power. He insisted that such monarchical authority must be checked by constitutional limits, safeguarding individual rights and preventing tyranny. The ideal government, in his opinion, would strike a careful balance. The decisiveness and neutrality of monarchy combined with the freedom-preserving mechanisms of constitutional law. By contrast, he regarded democracies as highly susceptible to factionalism. Competing interest groups, he argued, often hijacked political processes for personal or collective gain, ignoring the greater good. The principle of majority rule, far from being a guarantor of justice, could easily become a tool for suppressing minorities. Moreover, democratic competition frequently rewarded manipulation and populism rather than wisdom and ethical leadership. The focus on winning votes encouraged short-term promises over long-term vision. Schopenhauer was particularly skeptical of the Enlightenment faith in human progress. Philosophers of that era had placed their hopes in education, rational debate, and civic participation as pathways to better governance. But Schopenhauer was unconvinced. He believed that the average person lacked both the intellectual ability and the moral drive to engage meaningfully with complex political issues. Most citizens, he argued, were preoccupied with their immediate concerns and lacked the inclination or capacity to form well-informed views. Even when political opinions were formed, they were more often the product of emotion, bias, and self-interest than thoughtful reasoning or objective analysis. Schopenhauer's political philosophy challenges both liberal idealism and revolutionary ambition. With unflinching realism, he acknowledged the deep-rooted flaws in human nature that fuel political conflict, but he did not respond with cynicism or indifference. Instead, he proposed a sober vision. Governments must aim not to perfect society, but to prevent its worst tendencies from causing chaos and suffering. His thought remains a compelling reminder that any political system must begin with a clear-eyed view of what people are truly like, not just what we hope they could be. Schopenhauer's political thought, authority, compassion, and the limits of progress. The challenge of democratic politics. Schopenhauer believed that democratic systems often elevated those who could stir emotions over those who led with wisdom and integrity. In his view, democratic governance risked catering to the majority's basest instincts rather than empowering the most capable and enlightened individuals to lead. As a result, he leaned toward systems where authority was concentrated in the hands of educated elites rather than broadly dispersed among the general population, a conservative with a humanitarian heart. Despite his conservative political stance, Schopenhauer was deeply committed to alleviating human suffering and defending the vulnerable. He harbored no illusions that political action alone could create a utopian society, but he firmly believed that the state had a moral obligation to prevent cruelty and ensure the minimum conditions for a dignified human life. Liberty, justice, and the ethical role of the state. Schopenhauer was a passionate advocate for individual freedoms, championing the rights to think, speak, and worship freely. He argued that the legal system should prioritize deterrence and rehabilitation over retribution. His ethical concerns extended beyond humanity. He was a pioneering voice in calling for the legal protection of animals against unnecessary cruelty and exploitation. Compassion over idealism. Even though Schopenhauer was skeptical of grand political schemes, his moral philosophy led him to support policies aimed at reducing suffering. He often backed practical reforms, not because he believed they could perfect society, but because they could ease the burden of pain and injustice in people's daily lives. Material progress and its discontents. In economic matters, Schopenhauer maintained a critical distance from the idea that prosperity would solve humanity's deeper struggles. He acknowledged that severe poverty was a source of unnecessary suffering and that societies had a duty to ensure basic needs were met. However, he doubted that wealth alone could bring lasting happiness. In his eyes, affluence often bred new desires and anxieties rather than delivering true contentment. The restless will and enduring dissatisfaction. According to Schopenhauer, the human will, our innate drive for more, would always find ways to create dissatisfaction, regardless of how favorable external conditions became. Even in wealthy societies, people remain plagued by competition, insecurity, and existential unease. This led him to favor modest reforms that alleviated extreme hardship, while remaining deeply skeptical of claims that economic growth could fundamentally transform the human condition. Critique of revolutionary socialism. Schopenhauer was especially wary of socialist ideologies that promised to eliminate inequality through radical economic restructuring. While he sympathized with the desire to address exploitation and unfair resource distribution, he doubted that altering economic systems could overcome the inherent competitiveness of the human will. He warned that even in socialist societies, new forms of conflict would arise between individual ambitions and collective goals. The risks of concentrated power. He also feared that socialism's tendency to centralize economic control in the hands of the state could lead to authoritarianism. The suppression of individual liberty, in his view, was too high a price to pay for the pursuit of perfect equality. Instead, he advocated for market-based systems that included strong regulations and social safety nets, an approach he believed offered a more balanced path between freedom and fairness. Nationalism and the psychology of group identity. Schopenhauer understood that group identity, whether based on nation, ethnicity, or religion, often intensified the competitive instincts of individuals. When people saw themselves primarily as members of a collective, they could rationalize cruelty toward outsiders in ways they would never tolerate within their own group. In this way, nationalism transformed personal self-interest into a morally justified pursuit of group advantage, often fueling wars and international conflicts. Toward international ethics and cooperation. Although he recognized that group loyalty was a natural aspect of human psychology, Schopenhauer believed it should be tempered by systems of international law and diplomacy. He supported the creation of global institutions to mediate disputes, uphold standards of conduct between nations, and reduce the destructive impact of nationalism on world affairs, transforming political life through inner awareness. A philosophical perspective inspired by Schopenhauer. The limits of politics and the power of insight. Though Arthur Schopenhauer often held a skeptical view of the potential for meaningful political reform, he did not believe such efforts were entirely in vain. He maintained that deep philosophical understanding and spiritual growth could subtly but meaningfully reshape the political landscape. By fostering an awareness of the illusory divide between individuals, some people could transcend self-centered motivations and develop a genuine empathy toward others. From contemplation to compassionate action, those who attain inner peace through aesthetic experience or moral reflection are less likely to endorse policies rooted in hatred, vengeance, or exploitation. While such personal transformations would remain rare, Schopenhauer saw them as crucial seeds for long-term change. Even a few individuals, enlightened in this way, could elevate the tone and integrity of political leadership and discourse. The role of education in political renewal. True political progress, in Schopenhauer's view, would not come from technical expertise or rigid ideological training. Instead, it would stem from education that nurtures self-awareness and contemplative depth. Cultivating this kind of wisdom would encourage citizens and leaders alike to act from a place of understanding rather than ambition. Beyond institutions, a shift in consciousness. For Schopenhauer, the ultimate answer to society's political challenges was not found in new laws or governmental structures. Rather, it lay in a fundamental shift in human consciousness. A transformation that would reduce the drive for competitive striving that so often fuels conflict. Only by altering the inner life of individuals could humanity hope to overcome the cycles of discord that plague political life. Part 11. Influence and Legacy. Arthur Schopenhauer's philosophy left an indelible mark not only within the confines of academic discourse, but across the broader cultural landscape, shaping literature, music, psychology, and popular thought throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. Though largely overlooked during the initial stages of his career, his work later resonated with some of the most innovative and influential figures of the modern age. Writers, artists, composers, and intellectuals alike discovered in Schopenhauer's ideas a compelling framework for grappling with the more painful and complex aspects of human existence, dimensions often glossed over by the more optimistic ideals of Enlightenment philosophy. His penetrating examination of suffering, his pioneering exploration of the unconscious forces behind human behavior, and his profound view of artistic contemplation as a path to transcendence all served as powerful tools for understanding the evolving modern condition. The range and intensity of his impact reveal how enduring and versatile his core insights have proven to be, even as later thinkers challenged, revised, or reinterpreted his specific theories. Appreciating the extent of Schopenhauer's influence allows us to better understand not only the historical significance of his thought, but also its ongoing relevance to present-day discussions about consciousness, meaning, and the pursuit of human well-being. Among those most deeply affected by Schopenhauer was Friedrich Nietzsche, arguably his most significant philosophical successor. Yet, their intellectual relationship was far from straightforward. Although Nietzsche initially revered Schopenhauer, later in life he sharply diverged from many of his conclusions. As a young scholar, Nietzsche encountered the world as will and representation, and he described the experience as intellectually transformative. He was captivated by Schopenhauer's depiction of reality as driven not by reason or divine intention, but by a blind, irrational will. This concept became foundational for Nietzsche, who expanded on the idea that conscious reasoning is merely a superficial layer over a much deeper and darker substratum of unconscious drives. He also adopted Schopenhauer's critique of traditional moral values, which he saw as often masking self-serving motives. However, Nietzsche ultimately broke from Schopenhauer's bleak view of life. While Schopenhauer advocated for the renunciation of desire and the quieting of the will through ascetic practices, Nietzsche proposed the opposite, a full embrace of life and its inherent struggles. Rather than viewing the will as a burden to be overcome, Nietzsche recast it as a source of strength, the will to power, the essential drive behind all creativity, beauty, and greatness. To express this affirmation of life, Nietzsche developed concepts such as the Übermensch, or overman, and the doctrine of eternal recurrence, both intended as responses to and transformations of Schopenhauer's original vision. Nietzsche's body of work can be interpreted as a sustained, critical dialogue with Schopenhauer, accepting the psychological depth of his insights but rejecting his conclusions and reimagining their implications for human flourishing. Through this dynamic engagement, Nietzsche helped bring Schopenhauer's influence into new philosophical territory, laying the groundwork for key themes that would later define existentialism and postmodern thought. Even thinkers who stood in opposition to both Schopenhauer and Nietzsche found themselves grappling with the existential questions their intellectual clash had brought to the forefront of modern philosophy. Another major figure who acknowledged Schopenhauer's lasting impact was Sigmund Freud. The founder of psychoanalysis recognized Schopenhauer as a crucial forerunner, especially for his intuitive understanding of the unconscious mechanisms driving human behavior. Schopenhauer's analysis of sexual desire, concealed beneath conscious awareness yet deeply influential in decision-making, anticipated many of Freud's groundbreaking theories on repressed sexuality and the unconscious dynamics of psychological development. The lasting influence of Schopenhauer, philosophy, psychoanalysis, and the arts. Schopenhauer and the unconscious mind, paving the way for Freud. Schopenhauer's view that conscious reasoning often serves to justify deeper, unconscious impulses laid a philosophical foundation that Sigmund Freud would later develop into his famous model of the psyche, the id, ego, and superego, where Schopenhauer believed that individual identity was largely an illusion and that consciousness could stretch beyond the boundaries of the ego. Freud saw an opportunity. He envisioned psychoanalysis as a method to help patients engage more directly with their inner drives. Yet, a key distinction emerges here. Schopenhauer aimed to transcend the unconscious will entirely, while Freud sought a harmonious integration between the conscious and unconscious mind. This divergence reflects their broader philosophical disagreements, particularly about the nature of happiness and the true goal of therapy. Aesthetic vision, art as a path beyond suffering. Schopenhauer's aesthetic philosophy has had a deep and lasting impact on modern literature and the arts. Writers such as Thomas Mann, Marcel Proust, and Jorge Luis Borges drew inspiration from his belief that art offers a temporary escape from the pain of everyday life. He argued that true works of art don't just mirror reality, they unveil eternal truths beneath the surface of changing events. This concept influenced artistic techniques that use precise detail and specific characters to uncover universal human experiences. For Schopenhauer, profound engagement with art could momentarily dissolve the ego, allowing the observer to transcend their limited self. This idea has become central to understanding how literature and visual art can lead to deep personal transformation. Music and the will, sound beyond words. Schopenhauer regarded music as the most immediate and powerful expression of the will, the underlying force he believed animated all of existence. Unlike other art forms, music doesn't need words or imagery to convey meaning. It speaks directly to our emotional and existential depths. This perspective significantly influenced composers and theorists seeking to understand how purely instrumental music could communicate complex emotions and abstract philosophical ideas. Among them, Richard Wagner stands out. His concept of the Gesamtkunstwerk, the total artwork, was in part a direct reflection of Schopenhauer's insights into music's unparalleled expressive power, opening the West to Eastern philosophy. Long before it became fashionable, Schopenhauer engaged seriously with Buddhist and Hindu thought. His work played a pivotal role in introducing Eastern philosophy into the Western intellectual tradition, a trend that would gain momentum in the 19th and 20th centuries. He saw deep value in Indian ideas such as Maya, illusion, and nirvana, liberation, integrating them with Kantian philosophy to explore questions about reality and human suffering. This fusion created a framework in which Eastern and Western philosophies could inform and elevate each other. Schopenhauer's openness to these traditions helped inspire the modern fascination with practices like mindfulness, meditation, and yoga, now common in both spiritual and clinical contexts. Spiritual practice and rational inquiry, a lasting synthesis. Today, millions who engage in spiritual practices, from yoga and Zen meditation to silent retreats, do so in an intellectual climate shaped by Schopenhauer's pioneering efforts. Even those unaware of his work are influenced by the pathways he opened. By demonstrating that Eastern wisdom could be meaningfully explored through Western rational inquiry, Schopenhauer created a model that continues to guide contemporary conversations on spirituality, consciousness, and human development. Psychological applications: suffering, desire, and acceptance. Schopenhauer's ideas extend well beyond philosophy and art. They've quietly shaped the foundations of modern psychological therapy. His insight that much human suffering stems from our clinging to unfulfillable desires resonates strongly with current therapeutic models. For example, cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, reflects this perspective by helping individuals identify and change irrational thought patterns rather than striving to fulfill every desire. Similarly, mindfulness-based therapies align closely with Schopenhauer's view that we can learn to observe our thoughts and emotions without being enslaved by them. Compassion, connection, and the therapeutic relationship. Schopenhauer believed that compassion arises naturally when we recognize the fundamental interconnectedness of all beings. This insight has influenced therapeutic approaches that emphasize empathy, self-compassion, and the dissolution of rigid boundaries between self and others. Even therapists who have never read Schopenhauer often work with ideas that trace back to him, guiding patients toward healing by helping them see through the illusions of ego and desire, and by nurturing a deeper sense of unity and understanding. Conclusion: a timeless influence. From Freud's theory of the mind to the emotional power of music, from the pages of literary masterpieces to the quiet moments on a meditation cushion, Arthur Schopenhauer's influence endures. His ability to merge rational analysis with profound spiritual insight helps shape not just academic philosophy, but also the modern human quest for meaning, healing, and transcendence. Schopenhauer's relevance today: consciousness, suffering, and transcendence. Consciousness beyond materialism. Modern philosophical discourse on consciousness, meaning, and well-being continues to echo themes first explored with remarkable depth by Arthur Schopenhauer. His bold proposition that consciousness precedes and underlies physical processes still resonates in today's debates on the mind-body problem and the nature of subjective experience. Happiness, wealth, and the limits of prosperity. Schopenhauer keenly observed that material abundance often fails to produce enduring happiness. This insight is strikingly relevant in our age, where anxiety, depression, and a pervasive sense of emptiness persist, even amidst economic affluence. He understood that these conditions are not merely the result of external arrangements, but are deeply rooted in the human condition itself, individualism and its discontents. His critique of competitive individualism highlights how modern society often generates suffering through the very structures meant to foster success. Schopenhauer's view reminds us that no amount of social or political reform can fully resolve this issue unless we address the deeper psychological and existential drivers behind it. Transcendence through aesthetics, ethics, and contemplation. In contrast to both materialism and rigid religious dogma, Schopenhauer offered a path of transcendence through beauty, ethical reflection, and meditative insight. This alternative appeals to those seeking meaning without surrendering to either consumerism or blind faith. He showed that philosophical reasoning and spiritual practice are not mutually exclusive, but can instead enrich each other. The courage to confront suffering. What sets Schopenhauer apart is his unflinching confrontation with the reality of suffering. Rather than offering false comfort or shallow optimism, he sought genuine solutions to life's most painful questions. In a culture saturated with instant gratification and hollow promises of happiness, his call to fully understand suffering before attempting to overcome it remains profoundly relevant. From ego to compassionate awareness. Schopenhauer argued that true human flourishing involves transcending ego-centered consciousness. He envisioned a movement toward compassion, clarity, and inner freedom, a vision of personal growth that speaks just as powerfully now as it did in his time. Even if few achieve the complete denial of the will that he considered the ideal, his exploration of incremental steps toward this goal offers practical and meaningful guidance. A legacy of depth and wisdom. Schopenhauer's enduring influence is a testament to the power of philosophy that unites critical thought with existential urgency. His work bridges rational analysis and contemplative wisdom, realism and compassion. More than a thinker of his time, he remains a vital guide for those who seek depth, truth, and peace in the midst of conscious life's many trials. Arthur Schopenhauer crafted a philosophical vision that continues to illuminate life's most profound questions. His legacy offers not only intellectual clarity, but also practical wisdom, showing us how to navigate the challenges of existence with honesty, insight, and integrity. Part 12. Schopenhauer's perspective on women, sexuality, and love. Arthur Schopenhauer formulated highly controversial views on women, sexuality, and romantic relationships, views that have sparked significant criticism. While many of his assertions about gender reflect the entrenched biases of his era and have been widely discredited by contemporary scholarship, they remain deeply entwined with his broader philosophical doctrines, particularly regarding the metaphysics of the will. Despite the outdated and problematic nature of many of his gender-related opinions, Schopenhauer's exploration of sexual desire as an expression of the will to live offers a philosophical depth that continues to provoke thought. To fully understand these ideas, it is essential to disentangle his philosophical insights from the prejudices of his time, acknowledging both their value and their limitations. At the heart of his argument is the notion that human intimacy, especially sexual desire, is not guided by rational choice or personal fulfillment, but rather by the blind, impersonal force of the will. For Schopenhauer, the will is an irrational drive embedded in all living beings, primarily aimed at survival and reproduction. This drive often overrides our conscious intentions and emotional well-being. In his view, falling in love feels like a deeply personal experience driven by individual desires. We believe we choose partners based on their unique qualities and the happiness they promise. However, Schopenhauer argued that this perception is illusory. Love, as we experience it, is in fact a sophisticated mechanism used by the will to ensure the continuation of the species. Behind the veil of romance lies a biological agenda. According to him, the will orchestrates sexual attraction by subconsciously guiding us toward individuals whose genetic traits complement our own. This process is not concerned with personal compatibility or long-term happiness. Instead, it aims to produce the healthiest and most viable offspring possible. Even when such unions result in personal dissatisfaction, the will's goal has been achieved. Reproduction. He referred to this dynamic as the metaphysics of sexual love. Under this theory, individuals are drawn to partners who unconsciously compensate for their biological shortcomings. For instance, someone tall may be attracted to a shorter partner, an emotionally impulsive individual to a more rational one, or a physically active person to a mentally focused counterpart. What feels like romantic preference is, in Schopenhauer's view, a biologically programmed strategy for optimal reproduction. The more genetically complementary two people are, the more powerful their mutual attraction tends to be. This intense passion is not a sign of compatibility or true love, but rather the will's manipulation to bring about favorable genetic combinations. Passion, then, is not romantic, it is reproductive. However, Schopenhauer also emphasized that these biological compatibilities often lead to emotional and practical incompatibilities. The traits that attract individuals to one another in the first place can become sources of frustration and conflict in a long-term relationship. A partner who seemed ideal in the throes of passion may become a difficult companion in the routine of daily life. This conflict, he suggested, explains the frequent disillusionment found in marriages that began with intense love. Once the will's purpose has been served and children are born, the individuals may realize that their happiness and compatibility were never part of the equation. The romance fades, and what remains is a partnership shaped more by duty than desire. Such conclusions led Schopenhauer to adopt a profoundly pessimistic view of marriage and family. He believed that marriage often traps individuals in a conflict between biological instincts and personal fulfillment. While the will compels us to form families, it does so at the cost of autonomy, emotional stability, and the pursuit of higher spiritual or intellectual goals. Children, in this framework, represent the success of the will's mission. They carry life into the next generation. Yet they also place heavy emotional, physical, and financial demands on their parents, often limiting their ability to grow as individuals. For Schopenhauer, parenting exemplifies the will's ability to subordinate personal happiness to the impersonal goal of species preservation. The burden of family life in the pursuit of liberation. The obligations of family and domestic life often stand in stark opposition to the kind of inner detachment and self-transcendence required for true liberation. The emotional bonds and practical responsibilities inherent in familial relationships frequently tether individuals to the will's demands, making it challenging to rise above personal desires and achieve spiritual or philosophical clarity. Schopenhauer's perspective on gender and the will. Arthur Schopenhauer's views on women were deeply intertwined with his broader metaphysical philosophy. He believed that women were more intimately bound to the biological impulses of the will than men, owing to their roles as mothers and caregivers. In his analysis, this connection made women more emotionally attuned, more concerned with immediate practical needs, and less inclined toward abstract reasoning or intellectual detachment. He argued that women possess a heightened ability to read and influence human relationships, skills that, in his view, evolved as strategies for securing protection and resources for their children. Men, on the other hand, were seen as more capable of distancing themselves from biological imperatives, thus better suited for pursuits such as art, science, and philosophical inquiry. To Schopenhauer, this division of capabilities was not the result of social conditioning, but a natural distribution of roles, with women aligned with domestic life and men with cultural and intellectual achievement. Historical context and critical evaluation. However, it is essential to place these ideas in their proper historical and social context. Schopenhauer's interpretations were shaped by the limited scientific knowledge and rigid gender norms of 19th century Europe. He had minimal exposure to women who were formally educated or professionally accomplished, largely because such opportunities were systematically denied to women of his era and social class. Moreover, Schopenhauer's personal interactions with women were often strained or unsuccessful, and this likely colored his philosophical stance on gender. Modern research has demonstrated that many differences once attributed to innate biological sex are, in fact, the result of cultural expectations, socialization, and unequal access to education and professional opportunities. Contemporary findings reveal far more overlap than divergence between the sexes in terms of cognitive ability, emotional intelligence, and the capacity for abstract thought. While many philosophers still find Schopenhauer's broader metaphysical ideas about the will compelling, his conclusions about gender are widely rejected today as outdated and rooted in bias rather than evidence. Sexual desire, rationality, and the unconscious. Despite the flaws in his gender theory, Schopenhauer's reflections on sexual desire continue to resonate. He observed that romantic attraction often functions independently of, and sometimes in direct opposition to, our conscious reasoning about what will make us happy. In this, modern psychology largely agrees. Our desires and choices in romantic contexts are often guided by unconscious evolutionary drives rather than deliberate rational decisions. People frequently find themselves drawn to others without fully understanding why. These attractions may conflict with their conscious ideals or long-term goals. Falling in love often involves a temporary suspension of critical thinking, during which individuals may make choices they later regret. Recognizing this pattern allows for greater self-awareness and can empower individuals to approach relationships with both sensitivity and discernment. Schopenhauer's insight that sexual desire serves purposes beyond individual fulfillment remains valuable even when detached from his more problematic assumptions about gender. The suffering born from desire. Another aspect of Schopenhauer's philosophy that retains its relevance is his analysis of how sexual desire contributes to human suffering. He emphasized that the consequences of desire extend well beyond personal longing. Emotions such as jealousy, rejection, and rivalry for romantic partners have been perennial sources of interpersonal conflict, violence, and emotional turmoil. Romantic desire, while capable of generating profound passion and joy, also carries the seeds of suffering, particularly when it goes unmet or when relationships unravel. The fleeting nature of attraction means that even once thriving relationships are often subject to decline. Over time, individuals may feel disillusioned, betrayed not just by their partner, but by their own former emotions. A person may once have believed they found their ideal partner, only to later confront the painful realization that their feelings have faded or that their partner has changed beyond recognition. These moments of romantic disillusionment are not isolated experiences. They are part of the broader existential condition that Schopenhauer believed was marked by suffering, desire, and the inescapable grasp of the will. Schopenhauer on celibacy, sexuality, and the will. Arthur Schopenhauer proposed celibacy as both a pathway to and a reflection of spiritual advancement for those seeking to break free from the tyranny of the will. He regarded sexual desire as one of the most powerful and persistent manifestations of the will, making it especially challenging to detach oneself from the cycle of craving and suffering necessary for true self-overcoming. As long as individuals remain sexually engaged, they are inevitably drawn into the biological and emotional currents that anchor consciousness to the physical world. These entanglements, in Schopenhauer's view, hinder any serious attempt at transcending worldly attachment. Importantly, he insisted that celibacy should not be the result of rigid moral commandments or external religious obligations. Instead, it must emerge organically, as a natural diminishment of sexual interest. When celibacy is imposed through force or guilt, it often backfires, intensifying rather than lessening the mind's preoccupation with sex. Conversely, when a person loses sexual desire spontaneously, this signals a profound inner shift, a turning away from life's demands and toward spiritual release. Schopenhauer acknowledged that, for most, complete sexual renunciation remains out of reach. Nevertheless, by recognizing how sexuality binds us to the will, one can begin to weaken its compulsive influence. Though he was famously critical of romantic love and sexuality, Schopenhauer did not deny their capacity to reveal fleeting truths. Intense sexual attraction, for instance, can temporarily dissolve the rigid boundaries of the ego, offering glimpses of unity between individuals. During moments of deep emotional or romantic intimacy, people may feel a transcendence akin to what is experienced in moments of aesthetic absorption or moral clarity. Yet, Schopenhauer warned, this form of transcendence is deceptive and short-lived. While it may feel like a dissolution of separateness, sexual union ultimately reinforces the biological impulses that uphold individual existence. In the end, such experiences strengthen our attachment to life rather than liberate us from it. Authentic transcendence, according to Schopenhauer, lies not in a deeper immersion into sexual or romantic experiences, but in rising above them entirely, leaving behind the illusion of fulfillment through desire and moving toward a state of inner stillness beyond the reach of the will. Part 13. Death, Suicide, and the Indestructibility of Being. The nature of death in Schopenhauer's philosophy. Arthur Schopenhauer's reflections on death stand among his most profound contributions to philosophy. For him, death was not a tragic end, but a shift, a transition occurring entirely within the realm of appearances, not ultimate reality. What we perceive as the cessation of life is, in truth, just a change within the world of representations. The underlying essence of all life, the will, remains untouched. It neither begins nor ends, but perpetually manifests through countless forms and individuals. When we fully grasp this, we begin to free ourselves from the crippling fear of death that plagues most human beings. It also sheds light on why suicide, though it may seem like an escape from suffering, fails to address the true roots of our existential distress. From this vantage point, death is not the antithesis of life. It is simply another moment in the ongoing expression of the will, no more meaningful in the grand scheme than falling asleep or changing a tire. This realization radically alters our perspective on mortality and the significance of our individual existence. What truly ends when we die? According to Schopenhauer, when a person dies, what actually disappears is only the temporary appearance of the will, that specific, phenomenal expression shaped in space and time. The frameworks of perception and consciousness that created the illusion of a distinct individual identity simply stop functioning through that physical form. Yet, the will, the core essence behind the appearance, remains whole and unaffected. It is akin to a wave retreating into the ocean. The form vanishes, but the substance, the water, remains, still part of the vast sea. In the same way, when we die, our memories, personalities, and individuality dissolve. But what we fundamentally are, the universal will, continues. We don't go somewhere else. We don't become something new. We simply cease to appear as separate, individual entities, while our true nature persists, unchanged and eternal. The misunderstanding at the root of death anxiety, the near universal fear of death, while deeply ingrained, is based on a misconception about who and what we really are. We dread death because we mistake our identity for our body, our personal history, our thoughts, and our emotional life. Losing these seems like being erased, but Schopenhauer insisted that these are not our true selves. They are temporary masks worn by the eternal will. Our real being lies far beneath these fleeting phenomena. What we truly are is not the personality we display, but the will that animates it, a force not confined or defined by any single form. Recognizing this doesn't eliminate the natural reluctance to face physical death. However, it does dissolve the existential terror that comes from imagining death as the absolute end of our being. Evidence for the indestructibility of the will. To support his views, Schopenhauer pointed to a powerful analogy: our condition before birth. We have no recollection of that time, and yet we do not consider it painful or problematic. It was not a state of suffering, simply one of non-manifestation. If death returns us to a similar state, without ego, without sensation, without personal awareness, then why should we fear it any more than we fear the time before we were born? The dread we associate with death often comes from imagining our consciousness continuing in a void, aware but deprived. But that fear itself arises from a failure to distinguish between what dies and what endures. It assumes that our individual ego is what persists beyond death, when in fact it is only the outward form that vanishes. Our essential nature, the will, was never born and thus cannot die. It remains beyond the reach of death, untouched by time. Conclusion: death as a return, not an end. Ultimately, Schopenhauer offers not a grim view of death, but a consoling one. Death is not annihilation, but reintegration, not a violent break, but a return to the source. By understanding that our deepest self was never a separate individual entity, we can begin to loosen the grip of death anxiety and see our place in the vast, eternal flow of being. The eternal pulse of life. Schopenhauer on vitality, death, and liberation. The flow of life beyond the individual. Schopenhauer noted something profound. The life energy that pulses through each of us doesn't begin or end with our birth or death. It is the same universal force that animates nature in all its forms, from the blossoming of plants and the birth of animals to the growth and awakening of human beings. When we witness the vitality of life around us, we're not seeing separate phenomena. We're seeing the same fundamental drive that lives within us, expressed in countless new ways. Our individual existence is simply one temporary manifestation of this timeless, universal current. Life energy, a temporary focus of the eternal. The vitality we experience isn't something we generate or lose. It's a brief concentration of an eternal force. We don't create it at birth, nor do we extinguish it at death. Instead, we are like waves rising on the surface of a vast ocean, distinct for a moment, but never separate from the whole. In this light, death does not mark our departure from reality, but rather a transformation in how we continue to participate in it. Schopenhauer's reframing of suicide. This understanding led Schopenhauer to articulate a complex view of suicide, one that stood apart from both religious condemnation and secular rationalization. To him, suicide isn't immoral in the sense of disobeying divine law, nor is it a wise philosophical solution to human suffering. Instead, it reveals a profound confusion about both suffering and freedom, the inner conflict behind the act. Schopenhauer argued, the person who takes their own life does not truly reject life itself. They reject the specific pain they are enduring. At its core, the suicidal impulse is not a denial of the will to live. It's an anguished affirmation of that will. The individual still desires life, but finds their current experience intolerable. They attempt to escape suffering, not by overcoming the will that causes it, but by destroying its present expression, their body, their circumstances. But the problem runs deeper. Suicide, a misguided attempt at escape. Suicide, according to Schopenhauer, targets the symptoms, not the source. Poverty, heartbreak, illness, or disgrace. These are not the true roots of suffering. They are merely triggers. The real source lies in the nature of willing itself, our endless striving, our relentless desire for more, which remains unfulfilled by any external change. So even if one could magically erase all current troubles, new ones would arise. Why? Because the will, by its very nature, cannot be satisfied. It creates suffering simply by existing. Moreover, the method of suicide itself, the act of destruction, is not liberation. It is an assertion of will, a final act of desire, not its transcendence. True freedom lies beyond desire. Genuine liberation, Schopenhauer taught, does not come through force, but through letting go. The wise person does not fight life, but quietly ceases to cling to it. He contrasted the violent rejection of life through suicide with the quiet resignation of the sage or saint. These rare individuals do not take their lives. They simply lose interest in continuing them. They are not desperate or angry. They are inwardly free. For them, the desire to satisfy the will has naturally faded. They still breathe, walk, and eat, but without attachment. Their body continues, but the craving ego has dissolved. The peaceful death of the detached. When death eventually comes to such a person, it is not a dramatic rupture. It is the final note of a song that has already faded into silence. There is no suffering in such an end, no resistance, no fear. The ego, which once clung to pleasure and fled from pain, no longer holds sway. And without that grasping self, what is there to lose? On Schopenhauer's view of suicide and death, compassion without condemnation, Arthur Schopenhauer expressed profound empathy for individuals driven to end their own lives. While he recognized that such decisions often arise from flawed philosophical reasoning, he did not respond with condemnation. Instead, he acknowledged the overwhelming nature of human suffering, emotional, mental, or physical, which can become so unbearable that it overwhelms rational thought and philosophical contemplation. When pain reaches an extreme threshold, the ability to reflect deeply, especially on the existential implications of suicide, can be lost. For Schopenhauer, this inability is not a personal failure, but a tragic feature of human vulnerability. The very intensity of anguish that compels someone toward suicide may, paradoxically, block access to the insights that could have revealed a way beyond it. Rather than framing suicide as a moral wrongdoing, Schopenhauer viewed it as a sorrowful byproduct of the human experience, particularly when coupled with a limited understanding of existence. His philosophical inquiry into suicide aimed not at judgment, but at compassion. His hope was to offer intellectual and spiritual tools that might shield others from reaching such a desperate point. Reframing death. Transformation, not erasure. Schopenhauer's conception of death profoundly alters how we might process the loss of those we love. If death is not seen as annihilation, but as a transformation of form, our emotional responses to it may begin to shift. Grief is a natural and healthy response when someone close to us passes away. However, when grief becomes prolonged or overwhelming, it can signal a deeper misconception, namely, the belief that death is the total obliteration of the person we cherished. According to Schopenhauer, this belief stems from a misunderstanding of what death actually is. The individual we mourn has not vanished into non-existence. Rather, they have ceased to appear in the specific form that was familiar to us. Their true essence, the metaphysical will that defined their inner being, remains part of the eternal substratum beneath all appearances. Although Schopenhauer did not argue for the survival of personal memory or identity in any conventional sense, he insisted that the most fundamental aspect of a person is not lost with death. This perspective offers a source of profound consolation in times of mourning. It allows us to acknowledge the legitimacy of our sorrow while also recognizing a deeper continuity that transcends the loss of any particular form. In this way, understanding the nature of death can become a means not only of healing grief, but of honoring both the life that was lived and the greater reality in which that life continues to participate. Part 14. Religion, Buddhism, and Christianity. Arthur Schopenhauer cultivated a distinctive and deeply reflective engagement with religious traditions, setting him apart from many of his philosophical peers. Although he firmly rejected the anthropomorphic conception of God prevalent in conventional European Christianity, he found immense value in the mystical and ascetic dimensions of both Eastern and Western religions, particularly in Buddhism and the contemplative practices within Christianity. He maintained that the greatest religious thinkers had arrived, through intuition and spiritual insight, at the very same conclusions about human existence and liberation that he himself had reached through rigorous philosophical analysis. In Schopenhauer's view, religion, when at its best, serves as a practical framework for overcoming suffering and attaining inner peace. However, when distorted, it degenerates into dogma and social control, ultimately concealing the truths it once sought to reveal. This perspective enabled him to honor the spiritual wisdom embedded in religious traditions without compromising his philosophical independence or rational rigor. His synthesis of Eastern metaphysics and Western thought would later emerge as one of the most innovative and impactful elements of his intellectual legacy. Among all the world's religions, Buddhism occupied a central and revered place in Schopenhauer's philosophy. He believed it expressed, with unparalleled clarity and precision, the very truths he had uncovered on his own. The Buddha's Four Noble Truths, in particular, mirrored his own analysis of the human condition. The first noble truth, that life is inherently marked by suffering, aligned perfectly with his own pessimistic outlook on existence as being governed by the blind force of the will. The second truth, that suffering arises from desire and attachment, resonated with his belief that the will is a source of endless striving and discontent. The third noble truth, the possibility of ending suffering by eradicating its source, echoed his conviction that salvation lies in denying and overcoming the will. Finally, the fourth truth, the path to liberation, reflected his idea that aesthetic contemplation, ethical insight, and ascetic discipline could help one transcend ordinary consciousness. Schopenhauer was particularly struck by the Buddhist concept of nirvana, which he interpreted not as a reward for the individual soul, but as the total extinguishment of the will and the dissolution of individuality itself. Unlike the Christian notion of heaven, a promise of eternal personal bliss, nirvana represented for him a state beyond all craving, beyond all identity, and beyond all suffering. This vision was entirely consistent with his belief that true liberation does not come from satisfying the will, but from moving entirely beyond it. He admired Buddhism's emphasis on meditation, detachment, and the realization of impermanence, practices he saw as powerful tools for achieving the kind of consciousness transformation he described in his philosophy. The Buddhist teaching that all personal existence is ultimately illusory deeply resonated with his concept of Maya, the veil of appearances that conceals the unified nature of reality. He often referenced Buddhist scriptures, convinced that his work provided a Western, philosophical framework for truths that Buddhism had preserved through centuries of spiritual practice. Nevertheless, Schopenhauer acknowledged significant differences between his philosophical outlook and traditional Buddhist doctrine. While he embraced Buddhist ethics and psychological insights, he could not fully endorse the religious elements of Buddhism, such as karma, rebirth, and cosmic justice, as literal truths. These concepts, he argued, could serve as metaphors for the continuity and recurrence of the will, but they lacked rational justification when interpreted as facts about personal survival after death. He valued Buddhist meditative practices not for their supernatural associations, but as philosophical exercises capable of transforming human consciousness. In his view, such practices should be stripped of metaphysical dogma and understood through a rational lens. His goal was to distill the timeless wisdom of Buddhism into concepts that could endure the scrutiny of reason and find a place within a rigorously philosophical worldview. Schopenhauer's complex relationship with Christianity. Arthur Schopenhauer's stance on Christianity was far more nuanced and ambivalent than his well-documented admiration for Buddhism. While he openly rejected the dominant Christian portrayal of a personal God, an omnipotent creator who judges, intervenes, and governs the universe, his criticism went deeper than simple disbelief. He saw this anthropomorphic conception of God not as a metaphysical truth, but as a sophisticated myth designed to meet deep-seated psychological needs. He believed that the Christian narrative of eternal salvation and damnation did not transcend the human ego, but rather reinforced it. For Schopenhauer, such doctrines sustain the very self-centered consciousness that lies at the root of human suffering. In addition to theological concerns, Schopenhauer was deeply disturbed by the historical role of organized Christianity. He condemned its entanglement with political power, its contribution to social injustice, and its long-standing resistance to intellectual freedom. To him, institutional religion often betrayed the ethical and spiritual principles it claimed to uphold, mysticism and ethical resonance. Despite these criticisms, Schopenhauer did not dismiss Christianity in its entirety. He found authentic spiritual depth within the religion's mystical and ascetic traditions. In particular, he held in high regard the lives and writings of saints who had moved beyond worldly attachments and embodied true spiritual transcendence. Among the Christian mystics, Meister Eckhart stood out. Schopenhauer was drawn to Eckhart's teachings on surrendering the individual will and merging with the divine, ideas that echoed his own philosophy of renouncing the will to live. He also resonated with Christianity's core ethical principles, especially love, compassion, and self-sacrifice. These were not, in his view, merely moral suggestions but profound metaphysical insights. The commandment to love one's neighbor as oneself was, for Schopenhauer, a literal recognition of the oneness of all beings beneath superficial distinctions. Renunciation and liberation. The Christian ideal of turning away from worldly ambition and sensory pleasure aligned closely with Schopenhauer's path to liberation, a progressive detachment from all forms of willing. His critique, then, was not aimed at the essence of Christian wisdom, but at its confinement within a rigid theological framework that he saw as intellectually indefensible. Religious truth across cultures. Schopenhauer believed that the greatest spiritual teachers, regardless of religious background, had accessed the same essential truths through contemplative insight rather than dogma. Whether it was the Buddha, Jesus, or other enlightened figures, he saw them as individuals who had directly perceived the fundamental realities of suffering, compassion, and liberation. These truths, according to Schopenhauer, were not bound by any single religion. Instead, each religious tradition expressed them through its own culturally embedded symbols, stories, and doctrines. Differences in form did not imply contradictions in content. In fact, he argued that the diversity of religious expression reflected the adaptation of universal wisdom to specific historical and cultural contexts. This outlook enabled him to value the core teachings of various faiths while remaining skeptical of their institutionalized doctrines and rituals. His own philosophy, he claimed, offered a rational and universal framework, capable of harmonizing the deepest insights from world religions while discarding what he considered irrational or culturally constrained elements. Toward a philosophical religion. From this perspective, Schopenhauer developed what might be described as a philosophical religion, a synthesis of rational inquiry and spiritual practice. He insisted that intellectual understanding of metaphysical principles such as the nature of willing and representation must be complemented by direct, personal experience. He drew a sharp distinction between reading about the illusion of the ego and truly experiencing its dissolution. Likewise, grasping the futility of striving was not equivalent to losing the inner drive that fuels it. For Schopenhauer, practices such as meditation, contemplation, and ascetic discipline served a crucial purpose. They bridged the gap between theoretical knowledge and existential transformation. Yet he was adamant that these practices should be rooted in rational clarity, not blind belief. Their aim was not to curry favor with a supernatural being or secure rewards in a hypothetical afterlife. Instead, their true purpose was to initiate a shift in consciousness, one that would lead to immediate inner peace and liberation from suffering. Schopenhauer and the spiritual depth beyond Enlightenment rationalism. Beyond the limits of Enlightenment optimism, Arthur Schopenhauer respected the power of rational inquiry and scientific progress. Yet, he was sharply critical of the Enlightenment's unrelenting faith in reason, happiness, and material progress. To him, such ideals often masked a dangerous superficiality, one that ignored the darker, more profound dimensions of human existence: suffering, mortality, and the quest for meaning. While Enlightenment thinkers celebrated human advancement, Schopenhauer saw a kind of delusion in their optimism. The focus on worldly success and superficial happiness, he believed, actually fueled the very dissatisfaction it sought to cure. In contrast, the religious traditions, with all their imperfections, had preserved a deeper understanding that everyday consciousness and socially approved values were inadequate when confronting the most essential human concerns. Religion as a repository of inner truth. Schopenhauer acknowledged that the world's religious traditions, though sometimes flawed in doctrine, had managed to safeguard insights that reached beyond the ego and pointed toward transcendence. Unlike secular systems that often remained entangled in surface-level concerns, religion had long recognized the need for practices that dismantled the illusion of the self, the source, in his view, of most human suffering. He saw his own philosophy as a continuation of this spiritual endeavor, an effort to tackle life's ultimate questions not through blind faith, but through a modern framework grounded in introspection, metaphysics, and reasoned analysis. The corruption of religious institutions. Yet Schopenhauer did not idealize religion uncritically. He was deeply wary of what organized religion had become in many historical contexts, an instrument of dogma, coercion, and political control. When spiritual truths were fossilized into unquestionable doctrines, religion lost its transformative power. It no longer served as a guide to inner liberation, but became a tool for domination and conformity. He observed that when rituals became mindless repetitions, performed to appease social expectations rather than to ignite inner change, they betrayed their original intent. Religion's promise of salvation or enlightenment faded when it prioritized obedience over insight. A return to the essence of religion. What Schopenhauer called for was a return to the essence of religion, not its outer forms. He sought to reclaim the spiritual clarity buried beneath centuries of superstition, power struggles, and intellectual compromise. True religion, in his view, demanded integrity, the courage to question, the discipline to reflect, and the honesty to follow truth wherever it leads. This purified spiritual path, he believed, was not in conflict with philosophical rigor, but complemented it. Both philosophy and authentic religion required the same virtues: depth, sincerity, and a willingness to confront the hardest truths about human life, legacy and influence, bridging rationality and contemplation. Schopenhauer's unique synthesis of metaphysical thought and spiritual awareness paved the way for future thinkers who were disillusioned with both blind religiosity and empty materialism. His approach suggested a new path, one that honored the insights of religion without demanding belief in the supernatural, and one that embraced rational inquiry without reducing life to mere physical processes. This vision resonated with artists, writers, and philosophers who were drawn to the contemplative richness of spiritual life, but could not find themselves at home in traditional religious frameworks. It also helped fuel a growing Western curiosity about Eastern thought, especially Buddhism and Vedanta, which offered practices and perspectives aligned with Schopenhauer's own philosophical vision, a new model for spiritual inquiry. In Schopenhauer's work, many found a powerful example of how Western reason and Eastern wisdom could converge, not in opposition, but in dialogue. He showed that spirituality need not abandon philosophy, and that reason need not sever itself from the inner life. His legacy is the possibility of a philosophically grounded spirituality, one that transcends dogma and materialism alike, and which seeks not comfort, but truth. Part 15. Schopenhauer's Epistemology. Arthur Schopenhauer crafted a profound and intricate theory of knowledge that explored both the potential and the inherent limitations of human understanding. Building upon Immanuel Kant's revolutionary insights into how the mind structures experience through innate categories, Schopenhauer advanced the discussion by proposing that the will, not reason, is the deepest source of all knowledge and the key to grasping the true nature of reality. While he acknowledged the success and intellectual sophistication of modern science, Schopenhauer argued that it remains confined to the domain of appearances, what he called the world as representation. No matter how advanced or useful, scientific knowledge, in his view, cannot reach the inner essence of things. Still, he held science in high regard, recognizing it as the most refined form of rational thought available to us, capable of uncovering patterns, systems, and relationships that structure the world of phenomena. This nuanced position on science played a critical role in Schopenhauer's broader philosophical goal to point beyond the rational intellect toward a more immediate, intuitive understanding of the will itself. His epistemology, the theory of how we come to know anything, served as the foundation for his entire system of thought, while also revealing why that system ultimately needed forms of awareness that surpass rational comprehension. According to Schopenhauer, all human knowledge begins with direct sensory perception. This kind of knowing is immediate, detailed, and vivid. We experience it every time we see a tree, hear a melody, or feel the surface of a stone. These sensory impressions give us direct contact with the individual forms through which the will expresses itself. Yet, despite their richness, such perceptions are inherently limited. They offer no grasp of general principles or universal truths. To understand those higher truths, we must rely on a distinctly human ability: abstract conceptual thinking. This allows us to move from concrete experience to generalized knowledge about categories of objects and their interrelations. In making this leap, however, we trade the richness of specific detail for broader explanatory power. Conceptual thinking works by organizing our individual perceptions into general classifications and identifying the laws or relationships that bind them. For example, when we develop the idea of a tree, we filter out the countless differences between specific trees to concentrate on what they share in common. This abstraction enables us to discuss trees as a general class, no longer confined to the individual trees we've encountered firsthand. Through this process, we gain the ability to formulate universal statements like, "All trees require sunlight to grow," a claim that applies far beyond our immediate experience. In doing so, we gain predictive and explanatory power. Yet, this comes at a cost. The concept of tree contains far less detail than the lived perception of any one particular tree. Science, in Schopenhauer's view, represents the pinnacle of this kind of conceptual knowledge. It pursues universal laws and seeks to explain phenomena through causal relationships and systematic inquiry. Scientific disciplines like physics, chemistry, and biology strive to discover the underlying regularities of nature and express them in rigorous, often mathematical terms. When physics reveals that force equals mass times acceleration, it articulates a universal principle that holds true across all physical systems. When chemistry identifies atomic structures and periodic laws, it explains the consistent behaviors of matter. When biology uncovers the mechanisms of heredity and evolution, it reveals the deep regularities governing all life. Through this method, science achieves extraordinary clarity and breadth. It exposes the abstract frameworks, mathematical, logical, and causal, that underpin the astonishing variety of natural phenomena we observe in the world. But for Schopenhauer, even the most advanced scientific knowledge ultimately falls short. It remains confined to the surface of things, to the ways in which phenomena relate within space, time, and causality. Science can describe how things happen, but it cannot explain why anything appears at all. It cannot reach the inner essence of reality or account for the mysterious existence of the representational world itself. The limits of scientific knowledge, a philosophical reflection. Science has the extraordinary ability to uncover patterns and causal relationships in nature. It reveals the mathematical laws that describe how events unfold. Yet, it stops short of revealing the true nature of the forces behind these patterns. Take gravity, for instance. Physics can define its behavior with astonishing accuracy, but it cannot explain what gravity is, in essence, beyond its observable effects. Similarly, biology provides intricate maps of life's machinery. It deciphers the processes that sustain organisms, from cellular activity to genetic inheritance. But even with this detailed knowledge, biology cannot answer the fundamental question: what is life? It can describe life's functions, but not its essence. This inherent limitation becomes especially pronounced when science attempts to grapple with consciousness. Neuroscience can track which regions of the brain light up during particular thoughts, emotions, or actions. It can forecast behavioral tendencies based on neural activity, but it still fails to explain a crucial mystery. How do physical processes in the brain produce subjective experience? We can scan the brain while someone sees the color red, feels love, or suffers pain, but the scanner cannot capture what redness feels like or what pain truly is from the inside. Science, by its very nature, is designed to observe things from an external third-person perspective. Consciousness, however, is first-person and internal, accessible only to the one experiencing it. As a result, a complete scientific account of consciousness will always remain out of reach. No matter how advanced our instruments or refined our models become, they will never fully penetrate the subjective dimension of being. This is not a flaw of science, but a boundary of its method. The philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer emphasized the importance of recognizing this limitation. He argued that acknowledging what science cannot explain is essential for maintaining intellectual humility. Scientific inquiry offers immense value within its domain, but becomes misleading when it overreaches, pretending to offer total explanations of reality. Materialistic worldviews that reduce all aspects of life to physical processes are making a fundamental error. They confuse representations of reality, our mental models, with reality itself. Scientific laws are not the fabric of existence. They are human constructs that help us interpret our experiences. This is not a dismissal of science, but a call for balance. Science must be complemented by other ways of knowing if we wish to explore the deeper questions of existence. While science explains how the world appears to us, it cannot reveal what the world is in its innermost nature, or why anything exists at all. This philosophical insight sheds light on why scientific solutions to human problems often fall short. For example, neuroscience may illuminate the biological roots of depression, but this knowledge alone rarely helps sufferers find peace or purpose. Sociology may uncover the structures behind inequality or conflict, but such analysis doesn't offer personal wisdom on how to live ethically and meaningfully in a flawed world. Medicine can treat illness and prolong life, yet it cannot resolve the deeper existential issues of suffering and mortality, concerns that confront all human beings regardless of health. To meet these challenges, we must turn to other forms of understanding: philosophy, contemplative practices, and the direct exploration of consciousness itself. Science equips us with tools to master the external world, but it cannot replace the internal journey of self-awareness and spiritual insight, which alone can address suffering at its root. Schopenhauer also examined how scientific knowledge compares with artistic and philosophical understanding. Science seeks to uncover the general laws that apply across categories and cases. Art, by contrast, reveals universal truths through the depiction of unique individuals and moments. A scientific analysis of a rose might explore its cellular anatomy, genetic blueprint, and evolutionary development. An artistic rendering of that same rose, however, might reveal something entirely different: the eternal beauty, vitality, and symbolic richness the rose embodies. Each perspective offers valuable insight. Science empowers us to explain, predict, and control. Art invites us to reflect, feel, and connect with meaning. Philosophy attempts to bring these modes together, offering rational clarity where science falls silent and seeking understanding where art inspires wonder. In the end, the deepest truths about existence may lie not in facts alone, but in the integration of knowledge, imagination, and self-inquiry. The relationship between science and philosophy, Schopenhauer's perspective. According to Arthur Schopenhauer, a healthy dynamic between science and philosophy depends on mutual respect and clearly defined roles. Each must operate within its own sphere, free from unwarranted interference by the other. Science, in his view, should explore the workings of the natural world using empirical tools and observation. It must not be hindered by philosophical assumptions dictating what it ought to find. Scientific inquiry thrives best when it follows the evidence wherever it leads. On the other hand, philosophy must have the liberty to grapple with the profound questions, those concerning meaning, ethics, consciousness, and existence itself. These inquiries go beyond what empirical data alone can answer, and thus, they should not be forced to conform to scientific constraints. While they operate differently, science and philosophy are not adversaries. They can and should enrich one another, each contributing to a broader and more complete understanding of reality. Neither should attempt to dominate or dismiss the other's domain. When scientists neglect philosophical reflection, they risk falling into uncritical assumptions, believing, for instance, that reality is only what can be measured, or that everything reduces to physical processes. Such positions can lead to naive realism or overly simplistic materialism. Conversely, when philosophers disregard the findings of modern science, their theories can drift into abstraction, losing contact with the empirical world. The result may be elegant ideas that fail to resonate with observable reality. The most fruitful approach, Schopenhauer suggests, is an integration of both perspectives. Science offers clarity and precision in examining phenomena. Philosophy provides depth and context by interrogating what those findings mean and what they do not explain. This thoughtful integration enables us to recognize not just the reach of human reason, but also its boundaries. It reminds us that while rational inquiry is powerful, some dimensions of truth might lie beyond its grasp.